September 27th, 2019. From Fred Dodsworth to Cynthia Dodsworth. Mom, the dreams are getting worse. I don't know what it is. I never thought moving out and going to uni would bother me too much, but maybe I'm homesick after all. Homesick? Me? Can you imagine? I know you'll be worried reading this, but admit it, you're just a tiny bit pleased too, aren't you? I may be 18, but I guess I'm not as tough or as immune to missing the family as I thought I was. And I do miss you guys. I miss you and Jim and the dogs. I'd love to come back and visit ASAP if I'm honest, but I made a promise with myself that I wouldn't come home for the first 6 weeks, so I could settle in. I'm going to try and stick to that. These nightmares are making it hard though, really hard. Every night this week, I've woken up sweating, my duvet wrapped around me like a snake. I can't remember the dreams, but I remember the feeling. It sticks with me. I wake up panicky with this weight on my chest, a feeling that's half dread, half fear, like I'm about to sit my A-levels again. Only it's worse than that, because I end up creeping myself out too. I lie awake and listen to the noises in the building around me, the tap dripping in my ensuite, the hum of the radiator, the distant sound of drunk students, and I get so worked up I can't even shut my eyes again. There's this cupboard in my room that I can see from my bed, and lately I've gotten this idea that… No, I'm being stupid. Why even get worked up about it? It'll get better. Homesickness always goes away in the end. I'll just have to make sure I drink a bit more before I go to bed in the future, right? I'm kidding. Love you and speak soon, Fred. September 30th, 2019. From Fred Dodsworth to Cynthia Dodsworth. Mom, another bad one last night. God, I feel like I've barely slept. I don't know if it's the tiredness or the anxiety, but my mind keeps playing tricks on me too. Stupid stuff. Like last night, for instance. I woke up at 3 AM from another nightmare, leaned over to switch on my lamp and get some light in, and the first thing my eyes were drawn to once I could see again was the cupboard in my room. The door of the cupboard. See, the thing is, I remember that cupboard door being shut last night when I went to bed. Fully closed. I'm certain of it. But when I woke up at 3 AM, it was open. Just a crack. Just enough to show a slither of darkness inside. As I was lying there in bed, I felt that darkness was staring at me. It sounds stupid, I know. I know exactly what you're going to say too. You watch too many horror films and read too much Stephen King. Yeah, you're probably right. But even after I shoved the cupboard door shut again, making sure I pushed hard until I heard the mechanism click, I still couldn't relax. Something still felt wrong. The plus side to all this? I've made a new friend. A girl in my corridor called Fiona. The 3 AM club we're going to call ourselves. I found her in our shared kitchen after I finally gave up on getting any more sleep. She was sat there in a dressing gown, drinking hot chocolate, and she told me she couldn't sleep either. We ended up chatting for hours. I don't know if it was because we were the only two awake or because we both felt like crap, but we really opened up to each other. I told her about my homesickness and my nightmares, and she told me about her depression. She's had it since she was a teenager apparently. She's on meds, but it's particularly bad at the moment, probably because of all the changes in her life. You see, Mom, I guess I can't complain too much. I might be homesick, I might be struggling to sleep, but at least I'm not depressed, right? It can always be worse. I went to bed around 6 AM in the end. First thing I did when I was back in my room was check the cupboard door. It was still shut tight. I think I'm working myself up over nothing. Love you and speak soon, Fred. October 2nd, 2019. From Fred Dodsworth to Cynthia Dodsworth. Mom, I finally remembered it. What the nightmare was. I'm writing this now at 3:30 AM as a way of distracting myself so I don't keep staring at that stupid cupboard and... No, don't. Start from the beginning. Start with last night. Okay, right. Here goes. Sorry I'm a bit all over the place, but I ended up going out with the people on my corridor, and I guess I had a bit too much to drink. I wasn't planning on it, Mum, but as soon as I started well, I guess the homesickness is a little worse than I thought it was, because I didn't want to stop. I just kept going. I must still be a bit drunk too, because I keep glancing up at the cupboard as I'm writing this, watching it out of the corner of my eye, and I swear I can... No, concentrate. One thing at a time. Last night. Last night's a blur, if I'm honest. I remember getting a taxi into the town with the others, and I remember getting shot. I remember Fiona pulling me to one side to tell me she was worried about me. After that, I have a vague memory of being in a taxi on my own, and then struggling to get the key into the lock of my bedroom. I must have fallen asleep on the bed, because the next thing I remember is lying on my back, staring up at the ceiling, the room spinning around me. It was dark, and I could hear laughter in the distance. Laughter and screams. I didn't know if I was awake or dreaming, but it felt real. That was the thing. My mouth was dry and tacky, and my throat burned with the aftertaste of tequila. My head ached. In the dream. That's what I know it was now, Mum. Just a dream. I decided I needed some water, something to take the taste of my mouth away. Only, as I leaned over to reach for the glass on my bedside table, I heard another noise. Something closer. Something on the far side of my room. I remember sitting up in bed, squinting. I've got those blackout blinds on my window, and they only let in the tiniest bit of moonlight, so the room was almost pitch black. I could make out faint shapes, but not much else. I could hear noise though. Oh yes. As I stared into the darkness of my room, I could hear it. A soft scratching. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Coming from the direction of the cupboard. Scritch, scritch, scritch. I'm writing this now with the lights on, but even the memory of that noise creeps me out. It sounded so real, Mum, like there was an animal in my cupboard trying to get out. In fact, the only reason I know for sure that it wasn't real, that it really was just a dream, was because of what happened next, what happened after. In the dream, I was sitting up, staring into the darkness, and I could make out the edge of the cupboard door. My heart was beating so hard, I could feel it in my throat. I couldn't move, and as I stared at the cupboard, as I listened to the scritch, scritch, scritching going on and on, I heard something else too. A voice. A voice on the other side of the cupboard door, whispering my name. I know how it sounds. Classic horror movie crap, right? But you've got to understand how real this nightmare felt at the time. I was in my bed, and it sounded like that voice was calling out to me, like it knew my name. Freddy, Freddy. The last thing I remember before I woke up was the cupboard door beginning to creak open. Jesus, that's enough of that anyway. I'm creeping myself out again. I'm writing this at my desk, but I've angled my laptop towards the cupboard so I don't have my back to it. I can't stop staring at the thing. I keep imagining I can hear those noises behind it again. It's nonsense, of course. Whenever I stop typing, there's only silence. Except... The thing is, after I woke up from that nightmare, the first thing I did was head to the kitchen. I could tell you it was because I wanted a snack, but really, it was to see if Fiona was home yet. If maybe she was awake too and unable to sleep. When I found the kitchen empty though, I eventually wandered back to my room, and when I sat down at this desk, I noticed the cupboard door was open again. Only a crack. It's like that thing's doing its best to scare the hell out of me, because I could have sworn I shut it before I went out drinking last night. Maybe the mechanism needs fixing or something. Anyway, I'm going to go now. I just heard the others come back, and I think I'll go chat to them for a bit. If I sit in the silence of my room any longer, I'm going to lose it. Fred. October 4th, 2019. From Fred Dodsworth to Cynthia Dodsworth. I wish this feeling in my chest would go away. I wish it would stop. It's there almost all the time now. Not just when I wake up at night, but in the day too. A solid weight. It extends down to my stomach one way and reaches up to my throat the other. Like that feeling you get before you start crying. A blockage around the Adam's apple. I wish I could see you, because I know you'd say the right things to make it better. October 11th, 2019. From Fred Dodsworth to Cynthia Dodsworth. I told Fiona about the cupboard, Mum. I had to. It's been getting to me so much over the past week, I've barely slept at all. Each day feels like a blur. I've missed lectures, I've missed seminars, well, I'm not myself. Something's wrong. I know something's wrong. I'm not trying to hide from it. It's just, what the hell am I supposed to tell people? That there's something scratching in my cupboard and whispering my name at night? And even though it started off as a nightmare, I can no longer tell when I'm dreaming and when I'm awake. What would people say if I told them that exactly? They'd think I was crazy. They'd think I'm losing it. I think I might be losing it. Last night was the final straw. Breaking point. I had the same nightmare I've been having for the past few weeks. Only this time, when I woke up, I could still hear that scratching sound. I know I could hear it, and rather than lying in bed listening to that stuff on my own, I thought enough was enough. I'd had it. So I went to the kitchen to find Fiona, and when I couldn't find her there, I banged on a door until she opened it. She answered in a dressing gown, bags around her eyes, confused. I told her to come with me, and although she kept asking questions, she came in the end. She came to my room to look at the cupboard. I stood back in the doorway like a little kid, and I asked Fiona to check inside it because I felt like I was going to lose my damn mind if I heard those noises one more time. And she did. She checked it. The door creaked open when she pulled the handle, and from where I was standing, I couldn't see inside. But I could see Fiona frown. I could see her staring into the shadows behind the door, her eyes darting left to right, not saying anything. And as I watched her, I felt this dread building in my stomach. This dread that was maybe worse than anything I've ever felt before in my life. "Well," Fiona said after a moment, "you're not going to win any prizes for tidiness anytime soon, but I can't see any rats." "Rats?" I said back. "Yeah, rats. Maybe that scratching is coming from upstairs or next door." I didn't understand what she meant, so I stepped up beside her and looked in the cupboard. There were rows of shirts on the hangers and shoes on the carpet below. A wooden trunk towards the back. Nothing else. October 13th, 2019. From Fred Dodsworth to Cynthia Dodsworth. Mom, the good moments don't come often, but when they do, I grab hold of them. I grab them tight. Right now, it's the middle of the day and it's sunny outside. My blinds are open and the light's coming in. My head feels okay. The tightness in my chest is still there, but it's not as bad as it usually is. The cupboard's quiet. There's a question that keeps popping into my head, Mom. A question I don't like to think about, because I might already know the answer. I have to ask it though. If something crawls out of that cupboard one night and gets me while I'm sleeping, will anybody miss me as much as you? I don't think they would. I don't think so. But the sun's on my face. I can feel it as I type. Do you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of those long weekend dog walks we used to take with Jim at the beginning of the summer. The 2 dogs and the 3 of us exploring the new forest with the sun on our faces. I think those walks were the last time I felt properly happy. October 15th, 2019. From Fred Dodsworth to Cynthia Dodsworth. I can't do this anymore. I can't. It's in my head. It's 3 a.m. and I'm in bed. The lights are on and I'm playing music, loud. But even below all that, even below the sound of someone banging on the door in the distance, I can hear it. I can still hear it. The voice from the cupboard. Freddy. Freddy. It's calling out to me, but I don't know what it wants. I don't know why it won't leave me alone. I think if I don't confront it head on, Mum, it never will. Oh, Jesus. I'm going to open the door. October 15th, 2019. From Fred Dodsworth to Cynthia Dodsworth. It's you, Mum. Oh God, it's you. I'm trying to look through these photos, but I can't see properly. I can't concentrate either, because someone's crying somewhere, and there's this music, and the banging on my door won't stop. The trunk. It was all in the trunk. All this. When I finally took that cupboard door open, there was no monster on the other side. There were only clothes and shoes and this trunk. The scratching was coming from inside the trunk. But when I finally opened it, I didn't see a monster in there. No mice or rats. Just photos. A memorial pamphlet. A death certificate. I don't understand. Damn, how am I supposed to read over all this noise? These pages are all wet. It was Fiona that found me in the end. She was the one banging on my door that night last October. The one who eventually called security to come and open it. She told me later that she'd been worrying about me for weeks, and that night, even over the music I was playing, she could still hear me crying. When they finally got in, they found me sat in my bed with a wooden trunk open in front of me, paper spread across the duvet, photos mainly. I had a picture clutched so tight in one hand that Fiona had to prise my fingers open to get it. A little boy and a woman smiling at the camera. Cynthia and Freddie, aged 6, read the caption on the back. She'd only been dead 2 weeks when I came to uni. It was a car accident. Sudden. I remember that now. With the help of my counsellor, who I've been seeing for the past 5 months, I've remembered a lot. I remember how Jim, my stepdad, tried to stop me from going to uni at all. Said he didn't think it was a good idea. Told me to think about taking a year out instead, giving myself time to grieve. I told him I was fine, even though I didn't feel it, even though I felt like my damn head was tethered to my body like a balloon. And those weeks I spent in that room at university, they're still a blur. I remember drinking and playing music and locking myself away for hours on end. But I don't remember much else. Still, I've got those emails. All those emails I sent to Mum's old address. I don't remember sending them, but they're there, in my Outlook. A reminder. A reminder of just how low and how desperate I must have been. Those emails were hard to read at first, but I got through them in the end. I read them all. Now, when I reread them, I don't see the words of a crazy person. I see the words of someone who missed his mum so much he found a way to convince himself she was still there. I see the words of a person who was trying to protect himself, but only ended up doing damage. I'm not going to damage myself anymore. When my mum died, I took everything I had, my feelings and memories, and locked them away in a trunk. But you can't keep stuff like that locked up forever. The university agreed to let me defer my place, so this year I'm taking time to grieve. I'm taking time to talk with my counsellor and walk the dogs with Jim. It's cold out, but every now and then, on the better days, the sun will push its way through the clouds and touch the skin of my face, make me feel warm again. I still talk to her too, to Mum. Only now, instead of emails, I do it out loud, when I'm on my own, in the quiet moments I have to myself. I tell her about my day and about what I've been doing. I tell her about Jim and the dogs. I tell her I love her. And even though she isn't here anymore, at least not in person, I like to think that somewhere, somehow, she's listening. The sound of the lamp shattering the floor was enough to wake me up from a deep sleep that morning. I reached for the glasses on my nightstand, only to have my senses jolted, quite literally, by the sudden shaking of the ground beneath me. Alarmed, the only thing I thought to do was curl myself into a ball and wait for the earthquake to pass. The entire complex shook as the walls and ceiling groaned around me. I laid there, helplessly, while listening to more of my belongings shatter in the other rooms and furniture tipping over all around me, hoping above all else that the roof wouldn't cave in atop of me. After what felt like the longest minutes of my life, the tremors subsided. My thoughts were a jumbled mess of confusion and panic. Did that really just happen? I jumped out of bed and reached out once more for my glasses, only to realize they were no longer on my stand, but on the floor. To my luck, they were still in one piece. Unfortunately, the same couldn't be said for the number of my belongings that hung on the walls. A quick survey across my bedroom was enough to show that everything had fallen, strewn about everywhere as if someone had ransacked the entire place. My TV, along with all of my pictures, lay in heaps on the floor. I stood there, dumbfounded and frustrated at the mess, and imagining the dollar value to replace and repair growing larger with each broken item I had seen. Feeling dread seep into me, knowing full well that I would see worse horrors waiting for me beyond my bedroom. The noises alone had told me as such. It was as if a tornado ran through from the inside. Furniture was tipped over, shelves left open with all their contents spilt out on the ground. My kitchen alone looked like the aftermath of a war zone. An assorted mess of a variety of broken dishware, glasses and silverware, all strewn about ground zero. It felt like being thrown in one terrible dream as the dollar amount in my head to replace everything grew with each sight of broken and damaged items. I got dressed and was ready to leave my complex when a sudden rattling of dishes inside the sink stole my attention. I braced myself against the counter, thinking that it was the beginning of an aftershock, but with no oncoming movements and no other sound to be heard other than the sink, I settled back. I stood there, listening in as clink and clatter of dishes and silverware kept on. It wasn't as if the plates were tipping over and making noise. There was a strange beat to it, as if the noise was being deliberately made, like something was moving the plates from the underside. I moved over to get a closer inspection and see what was there, and could only see my dishes stacked over the drain. The intensity of the beating picked up the closer I got, and from there I could tell that there was something literally pushing itself up from inside the drain, attempting to get through the dishes. With each bump, the dishes were being shifted upward little by little. A chill ran through me, like every sense seemed to kick into fight or flight. All that pent-up adrenaline in my body was now forcing its way through and instinctively telling me to stay away from that sink. The top dish slipped loose to the side. I stepped a few feet back away and paused at the edge of my counter. My mind raced, trying to figure out what the hell was happening as the plates rattled away. I tried to rationalize that maybe it was a rat that had somehow found itself through my pipes and was attempting to break through. I quickly grabbed one of those steak knives from the floor and poised myself, waiting over the sink and hoping above all else that the rattling would stop. Another plate shook loose from the pile. "Come on already," I shouted, more in defense against my own fears as I stood there, knife trembling in hand and raised over that sink like a statue. Out of everything that's happened, I fully expected whatever was making that sound to suddenly burst through my dishes and attack me. But nothing appeared. After what looked like one last bump, the shuddering seemingly ended with an odd gurgling sound of water bubbling from the drain, and a small pool of water rose around the base of the bottom plate. Setting the knife down on the counter, I made one last glance back into it. The puddle seemed to stagnate with no other movement. Whatever had happened seemingly ended right there and then. I moved my hand just above the dishes, thinking to maybe move them away from the drain and see the origin of that sound. But I hesitated. It felt like I was hovering my hand over the jaws of some beast, and a feeling came over me that if I were to move those plates, I would feel that bite. I made my way back to my bedroom when a sudden loud knocking on my door caused me to jump back in surprise. "Erich, it's Mrs. Birkin. Are you okay?" I relaxed a bit, hearing a familiar voice muffled through the door. "I'm all right, Mrs. Birkin," I yelled back. I made my way to the front entrance and opened it to find her worried face staring at me. "Oh, thank goodness. I heard you shouting and I wasn't sure. Paul and I were just pulling up to our room when the quake set in, and it just shook everything." I was relieved to find that she was okay as well. Being new in town, the Birkins were about as friendly a neighbour you could get, treating me with a care that rivaled my grandparents. I was asleep when it hit. I probably would have slept through it if it weren't for everything in my room falling to pieces. I said that jokingly, trying to relieve the tension and worry etched on Mrs. Birkin's face. But that didn't seem to relieve her as she saw the mess laying just behind me. "Oh no, look at this place. And you were just settling in too. Don't you worry one bit, honey. I'll help you clean this mess up in no time." "Oh hey, no, it's alright." She raised a hand to shush me with an expression that reminded me of my third-grade teacher commanding the classroom to full obedience. "Nonsense. You're my neighbour and I'm here to help. Now, let me get a look inside and see just how much work is needed to be done here." A bit of relief settled in as we made our way to the kitchen. As much as I tried to play off the idea of being selfless, I really didn't want to clean this mess all by myself. The kitchen was proof enough that this was going to be an all-day event, judging from the carnage on the ground. Shards of glass and porcelain covered nearly every inch of the floor, along with my microwave hanging over the counter by its extension cord. Having seen all that she needed to see, Mrs. Birkin left and returned with some cleaning supplies. I took the broom and a pair of latex gloves and started with the broken dish shards in front of me, while Mrs. Birkin shoveled the pieces into a bag. "Is it common to get earthquakes in this area?" "Honestly, honey, it's the strangest thing. For as long as Paul and I have been here, this is the first we've ever experienced one." That wasn't a good sign. The Birkins have lived in the city since the 70s. For an earthquake to hit as hard as it did in an area that, up until this point, never had encountered one, left me feeling that this wasn't an average occurrence. My thoughts drifted back onto what happened with my sink, and I shuddered as my imagination played on a twisted vision of a clawed hand reaching through the drain to grab me. That's strange. I wish I could check the news, but my TV's completely totaled. A sudden groan from the pipes echoed from my bathroom, followed by an even louder sound of water bubbling emanating from within. The sound was enough to tear our attention away from what we were doing. That same bubbling noise that came from the sink was now louder and more distinct. Panic set in. Could whatever was making that noise in the sink now be in the tub? Even worse was the fact that there was nothing blocking the drain there. "Are you okay, honey?" Mrs. Birkin could see the unease on me. "What? No, the noise just... My plumbing has been making odd noises all morning." My nerves and imagination were getting the better of me. There had to be a reasonable explanation for this. At least, that was my hope. Well, you're in luck that Paul's a plumber. Let me go and see what it is for you and— No! I didn't mean to shout, but I was so sure that if I sent her out there, she wouldn't come back. Sorry, I just mean, my bathroom was already a wreck from before the earthquake. I'm kind of embarrassed about it, so I'll go and check first. You stay here. It was a terrible excuse, but Mrs. Birkin just rolled her eyes and waved me away, giving me the go-ahead. Going into the bathroom, I felt like I was walking into a lion's den, and each step in felt like walking through molasses, as if my own body was working against me from entering in. Armed with a broom, I shut the door behind me with the tub facing directly in front of me. The bubbling had stopped the moment I walked in, but I could see another pool of water had backed up from the drain, same as my sink. At the very end of my tub, where the drain had been, was a tiny black mass, unmoving. I edged my way in closer, leading with a broom, and upon a closer inspection, I heaved the biggest sigh of relief as I realized it was a tangle of hair covering the drain. The plumbing must have backed up from the quake. I set the broom aside and moved into the edge of my tub. I moved to wipe the hair away with my gloved hand and expected it to come off with ease. But, for whatever reason, it stayed there, unmoving, not even an inch from the drain, save for a few strands of hair separating from the tangle. I gripped it as firmly as I could and pulled, and this time I could see it give, but there was a resistance to it. I pulled even harder, and the strands of hair stretched and bunched even tighter, until at last it separated itself from the drain. The water began to plunge itself back through the drain, as I stood there with a glob of hair no bigger than a baseball in my hand. I made my way to throw it in the trash can, when it suddenly began to quiver in my palm. Two small yellow orbs jutted from the tangle of hair, with what looked like tiny black pupils transfixed right at me. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This thing was alive. I swatted my hand aside, but the glob stuck firmly on the glove. It began to tremble once more as a number of strands protruded from itself and reached itself around my glove, yanking me forward. With my other hand, I tore that glove away and tossed it inside the tub as the glob seemingly enveloped the entirety of it with hair. I stumbled backwards, trying to get back to the door, and fell on the ground. A high-pitched chirping came from the tub, followed by a quick tapping of what sounded like fingernails raced against its walls. I lay there, horrified, as four black, hairy legs curled themselves around the lip of the tub and heaved itself upward. It looked like a twisted version of a tarantula, with two grotesque eyes staring at me from the center of its body. It quivered once more as 5 indentations of what looked like human canines jutted from the end of its legs and leapt off the tub, racing towards me. I screamed at the top of my lungs, thinking I was doomed, when the door swung open. Mrs. Birkin slammed the broom down atop the creature and stopped it in its tracks long enough for me to scramble back up and out of the bathroom. Mrs. Birkin slammed the door shut, leaving the creature inside. What was that? I had no explanation. I doubt any of which would have made sense, given what we had experienced. The bathroom door thudded loudly next to us, and I could hear it clatter up and down the door, attempting to get through. Mrs. Birkin, we need to leave. The handle on the door started to turn. Mrs. Birkin rushed past me and grabbed it, holding it as tightly as she could. Get Paul! Without wasting a second, I ran from the room and through my main entrance to the Birkins. To my luck, their doorway was wide open. I ran inside, calling for Paul, but no answer came back. I screamed his name once more, and a chilling response came back to me. Another high-pitched chirp. From their bedroom, a dark silhouette shambled out in the shape of a person, only it was completely wrapped from head to toe in wet hair. It was Paul. A pair of yellow eyes lay in inset over where Paul's eyes would be, and from his mouth was a row of jagged teeth. It raised a gnarled, clawed hand over in my direction and lurched forward, shuffling my way as quickly as it could. I ran back outside and shut the door, racing over towards my room in hopes that I could reach Mrs. Birkin in time. My heart sank when I heard another, louder chirp coming from my doorway, followed by a muffled scream. I wish I could say I rushed in. I wish I could say that I tried to help and save her. But I ran from my apartment complex, crying hysterically. I drove as far as I could and slept in my car for 3 days straight. Each time I woke, I had hoped that I was back in my apartment, wishing futilely that it was all some bad dream. But my reality was an unexplainable nightmare. That damn quake. It all started from it, and something came from it. To this day, I haven't gone back, and the sight of loose air causes me to panic. Please, if you see something in your drain, run. Once your time on this earth ends, death will greet you like an old friend. Whether you embrace it with fear, hatred, or acceptance is a question that cannot be answered before you stand at its door. I can't tell you what comes next, nor can I offer you a comforting thought about an eternal afterlife. All I can promise you is that when it happens, you won't be alone. Up until Thursday, the 6th of December 2007, I had never considered myself anything out of the ordinary. As a teacher at the local high school, the best I could hope for was to aid in building our future. Though not an easy job, it was one I loved. Then, on the evening of the 6th, as I returned home after grading a bunch of unsatisfying essays, I received a text message from a hidden number. It contained nothing more than a time, a place, and a vaguely familiar yet generic name. Friday, 5:34 a.m, Lock Road 4, Juliet Florence. Any logical person would have arrived at the conclusion that the message had reached the wrong recipient. Yet, as soon as I lifted the phone and read the message, a shiver shot down my spine, and something within me felt compelled, beyond any reasonable explanation, to go check it out. The road itself was an hour's drive out of town, situated in a desolate area only occupied by abandoned farms and barren fields. It would have been the perfect place to lure someone out and kill them without anyone ever knowing. Despite this horrific fact, I wasn't worried. All I felt was compassion for whoever else would be there, without understanding why. I couldn't accurately explain the immense feeling of purpose that had arisen within me. It was an odd mixture of unrelenting fear, sadness, and pity. It felt as if my entire life had led to that very moment, and that nothing mattered more than being at that location at that time. Friday morning arrived, and I'd been lying in bed without a minute of sleep, in anticipation of what would happen. As 4 a.m. rolled around, I attempted to sneak my way out of bed, careful not to wake my sleeping wife, Anna. Of course, it was a futile attempt, with Anna being the lightest sleeper on the planet, able to sense my thoughts, and waking up because she claimed they were too loud. "Alex, what's wrong?" she asked without even opening her eyes. "Nothing's wrong, I just need to catch up on some papers," I lied. "But why would you think something's wrong?" "You had a worried breath," she mumbled, already drifting back to sleep. I let a brief smile slip and kissed her on the forehead. "Everything is great, Anna. I'll see you after work, alright?" She mumbled something incoherent in response, and I left the house. Secrets had never been an aspect of our 5-year-long marriage, but on that particular day, I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. On the hour-long drive over to Lock Road, 1,000 questions flew through my mind. Who had sent the message? Why did Juliet Florence sound so familiar? And what compelled me enough to risk following the instructions, or lack thereof, from such a cryptic message? It was a dark journey through the barely illuminated skies of dawn. Though the sun still hadn't peeked up from the horizon, it still gave the sky a deep blue hue. Once I got close to my destination, I noticed something down the road. It was a car that had flipped over, crushed under its own force as it had crashed into a ditch. I stopped my car and quickly approached the wreck, already preparing to dial 911. "Help," a weak voice called from the car. In the driver's seat, pinned between the dashboard, steering wheel and seat, sat a woman with a large piece of metal protruding through her chest. The debris had lodged itself into the seat, making it impossible to get loose, but even removing it would almost certainly have killed her, as it was the only thing keeping her from bleeding out. With shaking hands, I called for an ambulance. We were practically in the middle of nowhere, meaning it would take the ambulance almost half an hour to arrive, which would be more time than the poor woman had left. "It hurts so much," she cried weakly. A feeling of helplessness washed over me as the fact of her imminent death became abundantly clear. I could do nothing but keep her company as the life drained from her body. "I didn't think it would end like this," she said. "I'm so scared." "You'll be alright, help is on the way," I lied. She reached out, trying to remove the piece of metal lodged into her chest, worsening the bleeding. "You have to lie still." Despite my order, she kept trying to move, mumbling incoherently to herself. I decided my best bet would be to keep her mind occupied on simple questions, keeping her mind working as we waited for help that couldn't possibly get there in time. "What's your name?" "Juliet. What's yours?" "I'm Alex. What were you doing all the way out here?" "Alex? Oh no, I'm sorry," she said senselessly, barely audible, before she started to lose consciousness. No, Juliet, stay awake." I said it loud and with purpose, awakening her for just a moment. During the last few seconds of her life, she just stared into my eyes and whispered for the second time, "I'm sorry." Then she stopped breathing, and I could do nothing save for wait for the ambulance to arrive. I felt numb, empty, after having so futilely witnessed someone's life end suddenly and unexpectedly. The emergency services came to the scene and took a lifeless body away, while the police asked me a couple of questions to clarify what had happened. She'd seemed so familiar, and she responded so oddly when I told her my name, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I returned home without going to work. Anna had the day off and immediately noticed something was off about me. I broke down and told her about the accident. I told her I'd watched that poor woman die, confused and afraid, and that I could do nothing to help. What I didn't tell her was that a text message had told me to be there, not because she wouldn't believe me, but because something deep within me prevented me from uttering the words. She embraced me and tried to comfort me by saying I did my best to help her, that at least she didn't die alone. It was a minor detail, but hadn't I been there, she might have just faded away, rotting for days before anyone else passed down that desolate road. That should have been the end of it. Weeks passed, and I slowly got over the trauma. Then, as I headed to work one cold morning in January of 2008, I received another message. It contained a time, a place, and a name. Jeremy Brooks. This time, the address was a local motel, only 5 minutes away. I wasted no time and called an ambulance and got in my car to drive there myself. Being far closer than the hospital, I arrived before the ambulance. I rushed inside the apartment complex and barged in through the unlocked door. There, on the couch, sat a man I presumed to be Jeremy, pale as a sheet and bleeding profusely from large gashes on each of his forearms. It was apparent that he'd slit his own wrists and had simply sat himself down as he awaited his rapidly approaching end. He looked up at me with a fearful expression on his face. "Who are you?" he said as he fell over, too weak from blood loss to keep himself upright. I grabbed the t-shirt off the floor and wrapped it as tightly around his arm as I could. Even with 3 layers, it hardly seemed to stop the bleeding. "Come on, don't do this. Stay with me," I said as I looked for something better to wrap around his wound. Despite my best efforts, there was little I could do for him. Jeremy tried to sit himself up, but in his weakened state, he just kept slumping over. Then, a light lit up in his eyes as he was hit with the realization that he wanted to keep living, a wish that came to him all too late. "Please help me," he said. "I don't want to die." Whatever trouble had led him to this stage, whatever had convinced him it would be better to leave Earth behind, he was wrong, and he knew it. But I couldn't help. And by the time the ambulance arrived, I watched yet another person's soul fade away. Over the next month, I'd received another 7 messages, all with a signature, time, place and name. 7 people destined to die, alone and in pain. I tried everything I could think of to prevent their deaths. I called the police, but they could do little without any evidence that something horrible was about to happen. Next, I attempted to reach out to the dying people, but to no avail. Not a single person accepted that I could provide them with future insight. By the time they had died, and the 8th number arrived, I'd long since decided to just ignore them. Why expose myself to the harsh reality of death if I could do nothing to help? Of course, that just happened to be the one time Anna was looking over some photos she'd taken of us together. The message interrupted her session, and she immediately started questioning me. Oddly enough, I'd shut off notifications, yet the message came to taunt me at the most inopportune time. "What's this?" she asked. I quickly snatched the phone out of her hand, but the damage was already done. "What was that message?" she repeated sternly. "It's nothing, honestly. It's just something from work," I lied poorly. "Alex, don't lie to me. You've been acting weird for weeks." It was true. My random disappearances, my denial that anything had been wrong, I couldn't hide it any longer. I don't... The words got stuck in my throat. 1,000 thoughts ran through my mind. I knew how suspicious it all seemed. I expected accusations of cheating, a hidden drug addiction or worse. But instead of questioning me further, she just took my hand and said, "Look, whatever is going on that you're too afraid to tell me, we'll get through it together." While we stood there, with tears welling up in my eyes, someone knocked on the door. It was the police. "Alex Moore," one of the officers half asked, half stated. "We're here regarding the death of Juliet Florence, and we need to ask you some questions." I followed them without hesitation, telling my wife to call our lawyer, but even with his help, no one could explain why I'd been at the scene of death of not only Juliet, but 7 other people. They questioned me for hours, and I could provide few answers. Thought it was an extremely bizarre situation. Most evidence pointed towards the fact that I'd been helping the victims and not killing them. In the end, they let me go, but the investigation was pending, and at any moment, they could have come for me. Once I returned back home, I'd already missed the death of the 8th victim, whoever he was. He had died during my interrogation. I broke down and told my wife everything. If the investigation ended up with evidence going wrongfully against me, I needed her to know the truth. We sat down and I told her my story. I went over each and every death I'd witnessed and expressed the absolute hopelessness that lingered over me for each and every day. It was an unbelievable story, but she didn't stop once to question the validity of what I said. She just listened. When I finished talking, once all the facts were laid out on the table, she looked at me, her eyes glistening from tears forming in her eyes. "Alex, I'm so sorry," she said. That was it. No accusations, No follow-up questions regarding the validity of my story, just pure compassion. We just kept talking throughout the night, where we would go from there, and how I'd deal with watching all these people die. Then, as if a light bulb had been ignited between us, Anna came up with an idea. What if you're not supposed to save them? I looked over at her, expectantly waiting the next part of her suggestion. What do you mean? Why else would I be sent their way just moments before their deaths? What if you're just supposed to be there, by their side? Maybe all you're meant to do is give them some comforting words as they pass. I mean, you've tried everything possible to save them, but in the end, wouldn't they just have died alone if you weren't there? I let her words sink in for a moment. It was an almost ludicrous idea, yet it gave me the most profound moment of peace. More bliss and hope than I'd felt in the past 2 months. She was right. There was no logic behind that feeling, but I knew it had to be true. So, I patiently waited for the next message, and it wouldn't be long before it arrived. As it so happened, it would be my next-door neighbour, an elderly woman whose name I barely knew, but who I know had become a widow last year after her husband lost a long, winding battle with cancer. I walked over to a small house next to mine and knocked on the door, fully aware that she'd be dead within the next couple of hours. She was a lonely woman, eager to just have someone to talk to, and I regretted not spending more time with her before. She'd always been friendly to me, offering cake when she baked, asking about my work as I passed by in the mornings, but I'd always been too busy to appreciate it. I made no attempt at warning her about her ultimate fate. Instead, we just talked. She told me stories about her husband, and I just listened intently to each word she spoke. She smiled as the memories flowed back, ones of a life well spent, a happy one. As the time grew closer, she started feeling tired. I offered to make her some tea, and by the time I came back, she'd fallen asleep, never to wake up again. On her face, I could see an expression of peace, and I knew she hadn't been afraid. She'd been ready, and I hoped whatever afterlife existed would reunite her with her husband. From then, my curse became more of an ally. It was a job I had to do, to watch people in their last moments and comfort them as they left our world. I did my due diligence and alerted the authorities after each event, but it was nothing more than an anonymous tip, enough to lead them to the scene, but not enough to add suspicion. I simply held their hands or gave them a few words of comfort. I tried getting close to them before their last hour, be it just to strike up a friendly conversation or to buy them a drink at the local pub, and most left with a look of acceptance, as if they trusted my assurances that everything would be fine. Years went by, a whole decade of helping people pass peacefully to the other side. The power I'd called a curse so long ago had become a welcome gift. Then, in the late days of last year, as Christmas rolled around once again, me and Anna were wrapping presents for the holiday festivities and family dinners. I'd gone almost a month without receiving another name, but that would end quickly when I received another message that shattered my life with these simple words. Saturday, December 7th, 11:43 p.m. Anna Moore. I froze in place and just stared at the name highlighted on my phone. Anna quickly noticed my absence from rapping and jolted me back to attention. "You got another name?" she asked. I nodded, not needing to speak another word for her to understand. The look of horror on my face said it all. "Oh, how long do I have?" she simply asked. Her normal, cheerful voice turned dull and empty. We need to go to the hospital," I demanded, knowing full well that preventing the deaths was an impossible feat. "Alex, don't," she said before I cut her off. "We can stop this. It doesn't have to happen." We argued for a bit, and she seemed oddly calm throughout the discussion. In the end, She agreed to get a checkup, if only to calm me down. Of course, with a woman that appeared perfectly healthy, without as much as a cough, the doctors could only run her through the basic tests. To look for anything substantial was a futile task, as most tests would take weeks to return, which was time we didn't have. In the end, we were sent home without a single answer. "What if we leave? What if we just get out of town for a few days?" I suggested. "Has any of the 100 people survived?" she asked. She already knew the answer. I didn't have to say it out loud. Without a place listed in the message, it became apparent that she'd met a fate wherever she was. So, we decided to make the best of what little time we had left. In the following days, Anna stayed brave, putting up a beautiful facade of acceptance and joy. We reminisced about times long since past, looked over photos and held each other for hours. At night, I could hear her cry in the living room, terrified not of what was to come, but of what she'd leave behind. I did my best to comfort her, but there was something hidden under the layers of love and support. Resentment. "I wish you had never told me," she said. "You should have just let me meet my end, ignorant like everyone else." She was right. I'd taken away one of the most beautiful things about life. Its uncertainty. The idea of our temporary, fleeting presence here on Earth. The fact that any moment might be our last. The thing that makes us so tragically wonderful. And I'd taken it away. Despite that, she never stopped loving me. And on a final day, she made me promise to never give up. There would be people that needed me after her demise. They would be alone at the final step in their life, and I couldn't let them down. Once the time came, it was nearing midnight. We both agreed not to mention her rapidly approaching death. She asked if we could go outside to just look at the night sky one last time, to kiss her under the moonlight, like we did on our first day. But it wasn't meant to be. No sooner had she stood up before she just collapsed to the floor with no warning. According to the doctors, my wife had suffered from a deep vein thrombosis. Basically, a clot had formed in her leg to subsequently break off, travelling all the way up to her lungs, where it caused a pulmonary embolism. It killed her within seconds. The love of my life had died, yet the names never stopped coming. I was depressed, broken, and without the will to follow orders. I wanted to ignore the names, but I'd made a promise to keep going. For the next 2 months, I chased down dying names as I got them. 5 victims that didn't have to suffer alone. I approached them and made them feel comfortable and held their hand as they passed. But each name crossed off my list took away chunks of my soul. Without Anna to support me, I had no energy to keep going. I just had to wait until whoever ruled my life finally released me from my curse. So I did. Up until last night, when I received another message. One that differed from the rest. This time, there were no names, no places, nor a time. I was faced with nothing more than an innocuous question. "Are you done?" My mind raced. It was such a simple but overwhelming question. What would happen if I said yes? Would I finally be free? I thought long and hard before deciding that I'd fulfilled my duty, that my time had come to let go, and let life happen the way it was meant to. "Yes," I typed into the phone. Within seconds, I got a response. "Who'll be next?" Then it clicked, as if the past decade of my life suddenly made sense, or at least partially. Juliet, my first job, had not been a random death. She'd chosen me as a successor, plunging me into a life she herself had lived. Why she'd chosen me remained a mystery. Maybe we knew each other long ago, met once and the name stuck. Or maybe she picked me from a dusty phone book in her attic. But, just like her, I'd been faced with the same dilemma. I thought about the implications of choosing another person to suffer the same fate as myself. But before I could consider a name, another message popped up. Sunday, 8:49 PM, Hollow Street 7, Alex Moore. By quitting my job, I've effectively ended my own life. It's not a fate I'm trying to accept, and I've already come to terms that I don't have much time left, though I still have a few days to sort out my business. There's still one question that remains. Who's next? I took the job on the Belial because I needed the money. I'm not an educated man. I never had the head for school, and in my town, the best way to earn your pay is fishing. I'd worked on boats before. They said the Belial paid the best. They weren't wrong about that. My town is small and coastal. That is all I would say. I don't want to give away the name. If people knew what was out there, they might come looking, and I don't want that. My reasons will be clear soon enough. Captain LeBlanc told me that he named the Belial after his hometown. It's a little town in the French part of Canada, not far from Montreal. What he was doing so far from home, I'll never know. LeBlanc had a gaunt face, but a full head of healthy brown hair. It was hard to say for sure just how old he was. Anywhere between 30 and 70, I might reckon. His crew was small, and he paid well enough. There were 5 of us in total. Myself, LeBlanc, Tony, Luke and Ian. We'd often go out for a few days at a time, followed by a few days back at home. Truth be told, I preferred being out on the water. Not much to do at home, and idle hands are the devil's plaything. The trawler would depart just before dawn to catch the early morning fish. Some of the crew would sleep. One man would stay up to keep watch. Then, after a few hours, the crew would wake, have a cuppa, and set to hauling in the catch. We'd get to work, gutting and packing our haul. The guts went to the gulls. They were thankful for the meat. They knew when it was time to haul, and like cats, they got impatient if we took too long and shrieked at us to hurry up. We'd pack the fish in the hold and keep them in boxes, with a layer of ice to keep them fresh. It wasn't the world's most exciting job, and the process on the Belial was no different than it was anywhere else. But like I said, I was in it for the money, not for adventure. There was one odd thing about the Belial that stuck out to me. See, normally there's not much in the hold, save for the ice and the boxes. You don't need much else. In the hold of the Belial though, there was this tank. Fancy looking tank too, flooded with water and had wheels on it, although it locked to the ground so it wouldn't roll around. No way that the boat was built with it. It had to be a custom job, but I couldn't for the life of me figure out what it was for. I asked one of the other crewmen, Tony, about it early on when I'd just been hired. "It's a holding cell," he said. "Sometimes we catch big uns, not really the kind of thing you put in with the rest of the fish. LeBlanc's got speciality buyers though, some eccentric rich folks looking for something rare. We get one hell of a bonus when the tank's full." "What kind of fish are you putting in there?" I asked. The other sailor just smiled at me, showing his rotten yellow teeth. "Big uns," he repeated. "Stick around. Good time of year to catch them. I could use the extra pay." That was all there was to be said on the matter at the time. I didn't dwell on it. My curiosity would be sated soon enough. "Up, boy." The bank shook me awake. We departed about 5 hours prior, and I had taken the time to get what sleep I could. Groggy, I dragged myself out of the sunken cot I'd been dozing in. One of the other crewmen had brewed coffee. I snatched at my thermos to fill it up. I could hear the gulls impatiently screaming from outside, eager for the banquet we'd bestow upon them. "Good haul this morning," Tony said. He claps me hard on the back. "Hop to it, it ain't gonna haul itself. Come on, ladies." LeBlanc had disappeared into the wheelhouse, and while Tony wasn't formally in charge, he acted the part. I didn't much care for Tony. He was stocky but not chubby, with horn-rimmed glasses and a 7 o'clock shadow, and a slicked back hairdo that looked like the one I'd seen on every asshole motivational speaker who ever BS'd his way through a sold-out event with the same advice you get from Care Bears. He reminded me of Ty Lopez if he starred in Super Size Me. He wore a wedding band, but how he'd convinced a bird to marry him was something I'd never understand. I'd breezed past him and out onto the deck. The other two guys were hauling up the catch, and I moved to help them. Between the three of us, with Tony standing back and yelling orders, we managed all right. "That's it, lads. Beautiful haul," I heard Tony yell as the net was set down. Yet, as it moved, I saw movement deep inside it, something bigger than a fish. I squinted before I saw it. In amongst the squirming, silvery bodies of our catch was what I recognized as a human hand. I grasped for it, perched on the edge of the net. "Hold up," I called. "Someone's in there." "What's that?" one of the other men asked. I think it was Luke. "Lower the net, I see a hand," I called and waved for them to do so. I saw Luke move with the controls and lower it. As he did, I saw a figure pushing themselves above the fish, and I heard a voice. I think it was human. It sounded human, or close enough that I could not tell the difference, but I did not recognize the words. Tony had run to the net as soon as it was low enough for him to do so. I didn't notice the grin on his face as he reached for the hand, helping the person inside out. I knew it was a woman. Her tangled hair looked odd. It was a mossy, greenish colour. There looked to be wounds on her neck. "She needs a doctor," I remember saying, but neither of the other men paid any mind to that. "Get the tank," Tony said. I saw Ian take off, rushing down into the hold. Captain LeBlanc had stepped out of the wheelhouse and was watching as Tony and I pulled the girl free from the pile of fish she'd been in. Her skin felt cold and slimy to the touch, and when I saw a long, slick body with silvery scales, I would have sworn we pulled a large fish out with her. It took me a moment before I realized what I was seeing. That girl's lower half looked like a fish. She had shining, silvery scales and twitching fins. She said something in whatever unknown language she spoke, and I saw her weakly trying to push herself away from Tony. I ended up backing off of her, but Tony held her tight. Come on, he said, unconcerned by the fact that he was holding a mermaid. He just led her to the hold and peeked over to make sure the tank was in place. Her tail slapped against the deck. She tried to force herself out of his grip and very nearly succeeded. She would have if Luke hadn't caught her. "Bring the tank around," Tony called. I could hear it rolling along the floor of the hold, but I stood, dumbstruck, unable to react. This was a mermaid. A real-life mermaid. I didn't snap out of my stupor until I watched Luke and Tony toss the struggling creature into the hold. I heard water splash and wet flesh smack against the glass. "Close her up and lock her in," Tony cried. "We're getting a bonus, boys." He looked over at me, grinning wide from ear to ear and showing off his disgusting yellow teeth. "Biggin," he said, his voice brimming with pride. Luke stared down into the hold, watching as Ian rolled the tank back into place. I watched the disoriented mermaid swimming around inside, desperately looking for a way out. I could hear her babbling in her own language, no doubt begging us to throw her back, but no one listened. No one but me. I looked up at Captain LeBlanc. He smirked before returning to the wheelhouse. I saw him reaching into his pocket for his cell phone, no doubt ready to make a call. "All right, back to it, boys," Tony said. The gulls are screaming. It's breakfast time. Don't keep 'em waiting." Ian pulled himself out of the hold and nudged me, snapping me out of my stupor. I only took one final look at the dark hold before setting to work. I could still hear the frantic, terrified babbling of the mermaid inside. I didn't get the chance to see her again until we were close to done with the packing. Luke had been going back and forth into the hold to bring the fresh packed fish in. I had my station to tend to, but as we set the nets again and got ready for a few more hours of trawling, I had my chance. Nobody cared to stop me as I went down to the hold. I didn't mind the stink of fish or the cold. I can't imagine the mermaid did either. She sat at the bottom of a tank, completely submerged and almost curled into a fetal position. The position seemed so human. Everything about her from the waist up seemed human. Her head tilted upwards as I drew nearer. She studied me, and as she did, I studied her. Her hair seemed to have moss or algae growing in it, giving it a greenish colour. Her skin had a greenish tint and a pattern that I imagined was camouflage. But it was faint. Her face looked human, save for the gills on her neck. The fear in her eyes seemed so distinctly human. There was an intelligence there, one that I recognised. She kept herself entirely submerged and seemed to shrink back as I got closer. I stopped my advance. The last thing I wanted to do was hurt her. She was beautiful, surreal but gorgeous. She was an old legend come to life, and she lived up to it in every aspect. "Odd little things, ain't they?" Luke asked. I heard his boots thud onto the floor behind me and turned to see him walking up to me. "Yeah," I replied. "Very." "Look just about human, right?" he asked. Threw me for a loop the first time too. I hear there's inland ones, fish folks like this, but they can pass as real people. Can you believe it? Walking on two legs and everything. One of the guys who was with us before told me about them. "How many have you seen?" I asked. "I don't know. This one might be the 5th. They're rare, but worth it if you catch one. Most folks lose them. If you don't trap them quick enough, they get away on you. Usually they're disoriented after coming out of the water, but last year we had one that tore right out of the net. Gave Ian a right beating before it jumped back overboard. They're a lot stronger than they look." I found it hard to believe that this fragile thing could hurt anyone, but Luke sounded convinced. I listened as he lit up a cigarette beside me. "You gonna gawk at it all day?" Ian brought a deck of cards. "Thought we might have a round of poker before we do the whole song and dance again." "Yeah, I'll be right there," I said. I allowed myself one parting glance at the mermaid before I left her there, but she was never far from my mind. Seeing her stuck in that tank, lethargic and depressed, the fear written all over her face, it didn't seem right to let her suffer in a tank, and who knew what was waiting for her when we got back to land? No, it didn't seem right at all. I told myself to let it go. I tried to bribe myself with a bonus. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought of the mermaid, sitting there in a tank, alone and afraid. She'd been trying to speak to us. I remembered the sound of her voice, even though I hadn't understood the words. Thinking back on it though, I suspect that she was trying to beg us to set her free. I'm fine with killing fish. I could gut them all day. Fish stare up at you with wide, dumb eyes. Their expression never changes, even when they die. Fish are stupid. The girl in the tank though, she was no fish. I looked in her eyes. She wasn't dumb. I knew there was something there. Something either human or as close to human as you get. Either way, over the next few days, she was never far from my mind. I visited her from time to time, watching as she sat lethargically in the tank. I watched Luke feed her once a day. He tossed a few gutted fish into the tank just so she wouldn't starve. Otherwise, she sat there and did nothing. No hope for escape, and no idea what her future held. The poor thing. I pitied it. No, pity isn't the word. Compassion might be more fitting. On the day we made port, I knew I was going to set it free. I had to. I wouldn't sleep right otherwise if I didn't. I'd see those eyes in my sleep, asking me why I didn't at least try. I was on watch while Captain LeBlanc steered us into the harbour. Ian and Luke were down in the hold. I had no idea where Tony buggered off to. I didn't have much of a plan, other than to keep an eye on the Mermaid and wait for an opening. Luke had said they were strong. I was hoping I could tip the tank over when no one was looking and blame it on the Mermaid. Wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than nothing. It was early morning as we steered into the harbour, and when we were moored, I helped the other men unload the boxes of fish we'd packed. I saw Tony in the back, near the tank, wrapping it up in a tarp, making sure no one else saw what was inside. I reasoned we'd take the Mermaid out last. I was right. LeBlanc came by to check in on us when the hold was almost empty. He stared at us, then at the covered tank. Tony immediately ran to his side like a loyal pet. He and LeBlanc exchanged some quiet words before Tony went back towards the tank. I watched as he unlocked it from its place and rolled it towards the front of the hold. Tony hitched the tank to the crane and had it lifted out. LeBlanc met it down on the dock. He waited for Tony to help him wheel it away. "There he goes," I heard Ian say. "Time to get our bonus." "What are they going to do with it?" I asked. Ian just shrugged. "Hell if I know. Probably a zoo or something. Maybe they keep them in a lab." I bit the inside of my cheek at the thought of that poor girl in another cage, being gawked at by scientists with no idea what she was. "The less we know, the better," Ian said, as if he knew what I was thinking. Best to leave those things alone. I can't say I agreed with him. The next box I took was my last. I set it down on its skid and kept walking. Luke and Ian were down in the hold. They didn't see me leaving. I went off in the direction Tony and LeBlanc had gone off in. I kept a steady pace. They hadn't gotten far, and it wasn't long before I caught up with them. The harbour was mostly an industrial area. Lots of cold storage warehouses to keep and process the fish. People went about their business, and nobody noticed me tailing LeBlanc and Tony. I followed them towards one of the nicer warehouses. They headed down the side, towards a large door that LeBlanc opened so Tony could push the Mermaid in, then followed him inside before closing it behind him. It was locked again by the time I actually got to the door. Not surprising. I took a walk around the perimeter of the warehouse, hoping for another way in. I was in luck. There was a formal set of doors that I found unlocked, and I quickly pushed my way inside. In my single-minded purpose, I hadn't yet determined what I would do when I found the Mermaid. I couldn't just run away with her, and we were far enough from the water that she likely wouldn't have made it back to the ocean in time before she asphyxiated. But I didn't care. My one focus was finding the Mermaid. That was it. In the end, I suppose, I got what I wanted. I could hear voices up ahead and kept my footsteps quiet as I headed towards them. I recognized one of them as Captain LeBlanc and strained to hear his voice. Understand that the location is not quite the most exquisite. However, if you want a delicacy fresh from the depths of the sea, where better than at its edge? I saw light through a doorframe up ahead and stayed close to the wall as I peeked through it. What I saw caught me completely off guard. There was a wooden U-shaped table with several people around it. Most of them were dressed well and did not look like locals to my little community. LeBlanc stood tall near the head of the table, a freshly poured glass of wine in his hand. There was a small little grill, the kind I'd seen once before at a Korean restaurant out of town. The whole idea of that restaurant had been to cook your own food. They brought it out raw and... oh god. As soon as the thought crossed my mind, I saw the door at the far end of the room open. Two men escorted a gurney that would fit perfectly into the U indent on the table. I recognized the silvery shimmer of scales strapped to that gurney and the pleading voice of the mermaid. She struggled weakly against the bonds. Even from my vantage point, I could see the tears in her eyes as she looked at her soon-to-be killers. A hand went to cover my mouth, masking my own shock and horror as she was wheeled past LeBlanc and set in the middle of the diners. She shook and tried to raise a tail. She babbled hoarsely as she looked around at the assembled diners. "As promised, mes amis, fresh from the sea. Bon appetit," LeBlanc said with a gentle smile. He raised his glass of wine in a toast. Those at the table with wine did the same before they took up their knives and closed in on the mermaid. She screamed as the knives entered her flesh. Her eyes went wide with agony. I should have run in. I should have stopped them, but I remained rooted to the floor in horror. They cut away pieces of her, letting her dark blood trickle out across the shimmering scales and onto the gurney. I could hear the screaming sound as her meat touched the grill. I could smell her as she cooked. All the while, she screamed at the top of her lungs. Her head shook from side to side. She tried to struggle and free herself from the straps that kept her bound to the gurney. No one in the room cared. No one but me. I felt the tears streaming down my face as she was eaten alive. I listened as she begged in a strange tongue, screaming for this torture to stop, until someone forced a rag in her mouth to silence her. Even then, I could still hear her muffled sobs as they carved her apart. I could see bone through her wounds. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. She must have been going into shock. Tears trickled down her face, and as her struggles weakened, I felt her eyes on me. She was looking at me, and in that gaze, I saw her silent plea for help. Even as mutilated as she was, with surgical chunks removed from her, she was still desperate for a chance to survive. Her gaze was suddenly interrupted by a long, drawn-out scream as her abdomen was neatly sliced open by LeBlanc. "If you don't mind, I myself enjoy the liver and brain," he said. "You must try them. They really are something." She looked down as her body was cut open and more pieces of her were removed to be cooked. I could see her shaking, either out of fear or shock, but still, I could not will myself to move. I stood there, watching as her head rested against the gurney. Her rapid, terrified breathing was slowing. How much blood had she lost? I watched as it got slower amongst the dinner party around her. Slower, slower, slower. She barely seemed to react to each additional cut taken from her flesh or the additional organs removed from her body. Her last exhale barely left her. I could see her lungs deflating and her eyes staring vacantly up at the ceiling as she faded, unwilling and afraid. I watched her die. I saw the very second where she simply stopped. I think that out of all the people in that room, I was the only one who did. I don't remember anything except stumbling on legs made of jelly towards the water and falling on my knees on the edge of the harbour so I could vomit. Then I hugged myself tight, crying in shame, horror and disgust at what I'd just seen. They'd eaten her alive, despite her obvious fear, despite her obvious will to live. They ate her, and they didn't even have the common courtesy to kill her before they started. What I had seen would haunt me for the rest of my life. I knew it would. I felt that in my very soul. I let that mermaid die. I would not make that mistake again. I was fortunate that I had a few days off after what I saw. It allowed me, at the very least, enough time to compose myself. The bonus I got was generous, but not enough to allow me to let what I'd seen happen again. There was no amount of money that would make that acceptable. When the time came for the Belil to go out again, I didn't speak a word of what I saw. I focused on my work as best I could. The hungry screaming of the gulls made me uneasy now. The simple act of sliding a knife through the gut of a fish did as well, as did the sight of their pinkish organs. Still, I bore it and let my mind return to the mermaid. I obsessed over everything I'd done since I first laid eyes on her. I thought about what I would do different. I knew it was only a matter of time before we saw another one, and when we did, I would save her from that bloody fate. I wouldn't fail another one. It was over a month before I got my opportunity. It was much later in our trip that we found our second mermaid. We were already on our way back. Time would be short. As the net rose out of the water, I could see her arm hanging out. She was desperately trying to pull at the net and break it to escape. "Ho ho! We've got a big un, boys," I heard Tony yell. Luke let out a cheerful whoop as he brought the crane around to deposit the haul onto the deck. Ian had already taken off to get the tank and wheel it into position so we could toss her in, just like we'd done before. I could see the mermaid struggling in the net. She displaced fish as she fought to get free. She was far more spirited than the other one had been. Her scales had a greenish sheen to them. Her messy hair had the same algae in it, but she cursed at us in the same foreign language. "Well, well, we've got a fighter," Tony said. "Luke, give her a drop, will ya?" Luke let the crane drop her, and I heard the mermaid cry out in pain. Tony was immediately on top of the net, opening it and working to pull the disoriented mermaid out. He called for me to help him, and of course I did. Together, we dragged the disoriented mermaid towards the hold so we could drop her into the tank. I watched as she plummeted into the water. She rolled over inside of it, bumping against the glass and thrashing as she tried to escape with no success. "Lock her in, Ian," Tony said. "I'll go break the news to the captain." He grinned, flashing those ugly yellow teeth of his before taking his glasses off to clean away the specks of water on them. I watched them go before I went to help Luke start gutting the fish. The seagulls were hungry. Time to feed them. I joined them at the little work table we'd set up, and then picked up a knife to help them get started. The work went by in a blur. The movements were almost mechanical. Gut the fish, toss the innards, wash it, pack it in the box. Gut, toss, wash, pack. Gut, toss, wash, pack. Gut, toss, wash, pack. The knife felt slippery, but comfortable in my hand. I kept my head down and focused on the work until it was done. I tried not to think about the mermaid, but I could hear her babbling angrily in the hold. The last one had been scared. This one was angry. I imagined her struggling on the gurney, screaming in rage, and finally terror as she was cut apart. My grip on the knife tightened. I tried to block the memories and mental images out of my mind. Gut, toss, wash, pack. 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 Oi! As Ian took the last box of fish down to the hold, Luke shook me gently on the shoulder. "We're having a game of poker. You in?" "Yeah, give me a minute. I'll clean this up," I said. He nodded. "Alright then, thanks mate." He patted me on the shoulder and took off. The knife still sat in my hand. I didn't let it go. I set to work, cleaning up the tables and putting most things away. The knife stayed in my person though. The sun was starting to go down. We were due in port sometime tomorrow in the early afternoon. I wondered if they'd eat the mermaid immediately again, or perhaps they'd rush to get her served since we'd gotten in a little late. It hardly mattered. I looked up towards the wheelhouse where Captain LeBlanc was. I could see him through the window, looking out at the darkening horizon. He'd probably weigh anchor for the night, soon enough to turn in. I could see some coastline nearby. Not our port, but close enough to land. We were on our approach back home. These waters weren't good for fishing. Too shallow, too many rocks. I could see the lights of civilization far in the distance and a few boats even closer to shore. A good distance ahead of us, I could see a small outcrop, too small to be an island, but awfully far away from land. I was sure I'd seen it before, but I probably paid little mind to it. It was never important to me before. We'd pass it in a good 15 minutes or so. Tony, Ian and Luke were all below deck, not in the hold, no doubt having a drink, playing cards and getting ready to turn in. I knew they were waiting for me. Not wise to keep them waiting for too long. With a knife in my hand, I turned and headed to the wheel box. Captain LeBlanc barely turned his head to acknowledge me as I entered. "Something you need?" he asked. His tone was level, not angry, inquisitive. I remembered the way he cut the screaming mermaid open. "If you don't mind, I myself enjoy the liver and brain," he'd said, and I wondered if he'd eaten her brain. LeBlanc looked over at me, confused by my silence. He said my name again, tearing me out of my thoughts. "Is everything all right?" he asked. I looked him dead in the eye. The knife was gripped tightly in my hand. He hadn't noticed it yet. It was now or never. He gutted her, without so much as flinching as she struggled. He hadn't seen her basic humanity, and yet here he was, on the verge of killing yet another beautiful creature, and again I felt as if I could not lift a finger to stop him. I stared into his eyes, my own wide as I felt myself shaking. "Are you okay? You look white as a sheet." LeBlanc reached out towards me. The next thing I knew, the knife was in the side of his neck. I launched myself at him, forcing us both to the ground, as his hot blood splurted over my hand. I pulled the knife free of him. He weakly pushed against me, but he did not have the strength to stop me. My teeth gritted to stop myself from screaming. I brought the knife down again. It glanced off the side of his head, leaving a deep gash in his face. He struck me, almost forcing me off of him. "No," he grunted, defiant of his fate, defiant like the mermaid. He too wanted to live. I brought the knife down again. It found a home in his eye. LeBlanc screamed a strangled, agonized cry. With all of his remaining strength, he pushed me off of him. Frantically, he kicked to both keep me at bay and push himself away from me. I scooted back onto my rear, watching as LeBlanc tried to pick himself up. The knife jutted out of his eye socket. I saw his remaining eye wide with terror. He looked at me as I leapt to my feet and came for him again. He could only desperately raise his hands to defend himself, as, in my madness, I seized him by the hair and slammed his head against the rear wall of the wheelhouse. He grunted in pain and tried to pull away from me. He twisted his body, his back towards me, and I clumsily pushed him forward. He half fell, half stumbled toward the dashboard. As he hit it, his head jerked forwards. It must have been simple bad luck that it struck the wrong angle. The knife was forced further into his skull, and LeBlanc's legs gave out beneath him. He sagged to the floor and hit the ground with a heavy thud. Then there was silence. He did not move again. Blood pooled around his head from his many wounds, and all I could do was stare helplessly. I looked down through the window at the deck. I was alone. Ahead, I could see the rocky outcrop, remembered what I'd set out to do now. I tore my eyes away from LeBlanc and put my hands on the wheel. Slowly, I steered the Belial towards the rocks and increased our speed. The engine would do the rest. With the course set, I made my way out of the wheelhouse and down to the hold. The tank waited for me, and in it I saw the mermaid. She was a vision to behold, just as the last one had been. She looked up at me as I drew nearer, pressing her hands against the glass and watching me as I worked. "You'll be free soon," I promised her. She did not reply. She simply studied me with her lovely green eyes as I unlocked the tank from its position, allowing it to slide about freely. I took a step back, knowing what was about to happen, and yet still not ready for it. The mermaid looked at me with a mixture of expressions: confusion, frustration, fear. The trawler shifted, so did her tank. She looked around, concerned. I could hear footsteps above me. "What the hell's taking so long?" I heard Tony ask. "We're all waiting on you." I looked back to see him coming down into the hold. He was just a few feet in front of me when the Belial hit the rocks. His reaction was more intense than I had expected. In an instant, my world turned sideways. My feet no longer touched the ground. Neither did Tony's. He struggled to keep his balance before he was dashed against the wall, then tumbling up against the ceiling. I heard glass shatter and felt water splash against me in the moment before I saw water gushing up through the opening to the hold. Tony was tossed to the side as it flowed in, and it hit me suddenly as well, shockingly cold and salty. I heard Tony scream my name and saw him trying to pick himself up as the hold began to flood. Boxes of fish and ice had been strewn about. I'd never seen Tony so scared in my life. "Run!" I heard him yell. He stumbled towards me as fast as he possibly could. He was soaked to the bone. His glasses were missing, but he was coming for me. "Go! Run!" I heard glass creaking behind me and turned to see the mermaid pushing her way out of her broken prison. She poked her head out and fixed me in a lovely gaze. I met her eyes and took a step towards her. She was so beautiful, just like the last one. Her skin seemed so smooth, her breasts were just perfect. I needed to touch her, to feel her skin under my palm. I needed to. Instead, I felt Tony's hand on me, pulling me aside in the moment before she lunged. He screamed as her weight bore down on him. The water around him ran red. I stumbled back, listening as he shrieked in agony and listening to the sounds of his flesh being torn from his bones. I could see a familiar, mortal terror in his eyes. The mermaid had him pinned. There was no escape. I stumbled backwards, my heart racing at the sight of him dying. I couldn't watch. I didn't want to watch. But I did. She sank her teeth into his throat, tearing out a mouthful of flesh and swallowing it whole. After another bite, Tony's head was torn clean off his body. She just kept searching for more meat to consume, and yet, for just a moment, she looked up at me. Her lips curled back in a snarl, showing needle-like, blood-stained teeth. As the hold flooded, she moved towards me. The water wasn't deep enough yet to swim, but even without swimming, she was faster than I could have imagined. Her body twisted like a snake as she raced towards me, using her arms to move herself forwards. I backpedaled as fast as I could before suddenly the ground beneath me gave out. I'd reached the entrance of the hold and fell backwards into the deep, dark waters. I kicked and struggled to find my way to the surface. All I found was the inverted deck of the Belial. My lungs screamed for air as I felt along it until I reached the edge. Then I shot up to the surface, breaking it and sucking in greedy lungfuls of air. I flailed, trying to find something solid to cling to. It wasn't long before I found rocks and managed to crawl up onto them. I felt like I was only barely alive. My ears were ringing, my pulse was pounding. I coughed up seawater and felt truly exhausted. My muscles gave out and I collapsed onto the hard stone. The last thing I remember seeing was the inverted shape of the Belial sinking in the fading sunlight. Then I lost consciousness. Most of Tony, Luke, Ian and LeBlanc's bodies were eventually recovered in the weeks following the sinking of the Belial. I'm told that there was significant damage done to them. It's believed that they were partially eaten by some of the local fauna. Fish can do a lot to a man's face, you know. For what it's worth, I don't think they ever figured out that LeBlanc had been murdered. His head was in such a sorry state and the knife was long gone. Nobody bothered to investigate further. I am the sole survivor of the Belial. I am the only person who knows what happened on that ship and what they kept in that tank in the hold. I don't know if I still believe what I did was the right thing. At night, I lie awake remembering the sounds of death, the first mermaid, Tony, Captain LeBlanc, Luke and Ian, deaths I caused through my action or inaction. I was already damned. The screams of that mermaid would have haunted me forever. But Tony and LeBlanc, those I brought on myself. I think Tony's death is the one that weighs on me the most. He pulled me out of the path of that mermaid. Were it not for him, I would likely be dead as well. The irony that he died to save the man who doomed him haunts me, but not as much as the way he screamed as he was eaten alive. He sounded exactly like the mermaid at the banquet. Police were unable to locate the missing children until 3 p.m. the next day. They didn't even know the exact location where they'd set up camp the night before. It was the smell of rot and the hot air that ultimately led them to the tent which the boys had pitched next to the creek. Seth leaned forward in his seat. He had his finger in front of him, reading the article out loud while he followed line by line with his finger. The blue light from his triple monitor setup glowed in his glaring eyes. All 3 youths were found with the crumpled and tattered remains of their tent collapsed on top of them. Their bodies had been beaten over and over with a blunt weapon, which authorities are yet to locate. It's speculated the 3 14-year-old boys were already dead before the unknown assailant, still at large, started stabbing at their bodies repeatedly through the fabric. I turned away from him before he could glance over and make eye contact. I sat on the edge of his bed and then lay all the way down. I wondered when he'd last washed the sheets. Over a month at least. It was only to be expected. No one around to impress when you've deliberately turned yourself into a social recluse. Of course, it had become my responsibility to address the issue. I suppose his mother had exhausted all the nagging techniques she could muster over the past couple of weeks before she decided to try giving me a call. In fairness, I'd known Seth since middle school. He'd always been one to experience his temporary bouts of timidness and introversion, but this was taking it to the next level. When you go nearly 4 weeks only travelling to and from work and stay locked in your room on the weekend, ignoring all texts and calls, bailing on plans you've already made, there's a problem there. Something is lingering beneath the surface. Terrifying, isn't it? Seth said. He narrowed his head closer to the screens. The more I research it, the more I see what a high frequency of murders and disappearances this area has, but way more than 12 times the national average. Where did you get this figure, Seth? I've been super into these cases recently. Obsessed? Whatever you want to call it. It's just impossible to ignore once you lay it out in front of you. It's like they are neatly distributed among the surrounding townships throughout the county. Like they've been spread out just far enough so no one could piece it all together on first glance. I'm starting to think I should be a detective or something. I'd be really good at this line of work. Either that, or you'd end up like one of the unsolved mysteries yourself. I tried to say it as jokingly as I could, hoping I would get some kind of light-hearted response out of him. Of course, he gave me none. It was almost as if he didn't even hear me. All he could see was the murder article on his computer. I checked his bedside table. The digital alarm had just turned 7, and that meant we were starting to run out of time. We needed to be headed back to my place to start pre-drinking within the hour so we could get a good buzz on before we met up with the other guys downtown. I grabbed a mini football and started throwing it up and down. Do you remember the Gianno Falco case? He asked. He started clicking through more articles, bringing different news reports onto his screen. If I were to pour you a shot of whiskey right here and now, would you take it? He scoffed at me and waved the back of his hand at me. Do you remember the Falco case? No. I don't understand how people just forget these things, he said and shook his head. It wasn't even 18 months ago. Happened a little bit outside downtown. He was walking his dog, past tons of witnesses who confirmed they saw him. He goes over Huntington Bridge and is never seen on the busy street from the other side. So what, Seth? So what? The railings are like 6 feet high. You could get over them if you tried. So maybe he did try? Yes, that's what you, the police, and everyone else in town seems to think. Just weird that when they found his body downriver at the dam 3 days later, there was light bruising around his eyes and his forehead. So you think someone beat him up and tossed him over? Yes, and I think they took his dog with him afterwards. They never found it. And this just happened randomly in broad daylight. Broad daylight? Yes. Randomly? No. I really don't think so. Come here, check this out. I tossed the football from hand to hand and then finally decided to sit up. I scooched to the end of the bed to get a closer look. What do you think of this picture? He said. It was a black and white photo of 2 men. One was Falco. I could recognize his face from the other articles he had open. He was dressed in a tux and stood in front of a boardroom table, shaking hands with an old man. Whoever that old man was, he had a really abnormal look about him, the kind you would take a second glance at if you saw them on the street. He had bulging, almost rectangular shaped eyes, pulled to the far sides of his face like a hammerhead shark. His flat head was completely bald and covered in liver spots. Grey and curled hair lined the sides of his head. His crooked smile was missing teeth all over. What's the significance about this picture? Is this some sort of special article? It's not from an article. I found it myself. I peered down at Seth from the corners of my eyes. The way he was still so fixated on the screens unnerved me. Such attention to detail and any particular subject required some level of unhealthy obsession, and I wasn't convinced this fascination would necessarily yield positive results. You found it on your own? Yeah, and it's damn creepy, right? It's not the only thing that's creepy. It's also not a one-of-a-kind image. Here, check this out. His head darted between the 3 monitors. His fingers scaled the keyboard while he typed in the 3 boys' names from the tent murder case and brought up their Facebook pages, and then started scrolling through them. He searched through the photos of deceased children. He scrolled over the well wishes and sentimental posts from friends and loved ones. He passed by them like they were nothing, mere inconveniences slowing him down from where he needed to go. All of this happened while I stood silent over his shoulder. I needed to get out of that room. I had to think of an excuse to leave and then call his mother on the way home and make sure she fully understood the extent of her only son's social and mental issues. This had progressed well past the point where a talk with an old friend could fix things. This needed to be addressed by a professional. There, he yelled out so loud it startled me and snapped me back into focus. He had a picture of one of the boys in his school uniform. He was at what looked to be some kind of fun run or some other outdoor charity event. He was on a soccer field with students and parents all over the place. He stood right in the center of the photo, his face definitely one of the boys pictured in the tent murder article. He stood separate from the other children and shook hands with the same creepy-looking man from Falco's boardroom picture. The old man was dressed in the same button-up shirt and corduroy slacks. A cold shiver ran down my neck to my lower back. I needed to sit on his bed again to collect myself. Is that the same guy? Yes. How did you find this? Research. It's possible it's a coincidence, 10,000 people in town. Not that big of a place. You think so? He said. He started clicking wildly again, this time bringing up the articles of someone I did know. Yuri Malarkey. He transferred to our school last year and was fitting in super well until he died in a car accident driving home from a party over Christmas break. You're not going to show me what I think you're going to show me. He opened Yuri's Facebook page and scrolled through his photos. And sure enough, he'd found it. He stood on the sideline in full gear during a football game at his old school. A wall of coaching staff was lined up behind him. Sure enough, that same old man was there, leaning over and shaking his hand. I didn't know what to say. I was at a loss. The fact that we had stumbled upon this was something that should never have happened. The fact that such a connection could exist was so hard to fathom. Yet, there it was. right in front of me. "Glass of water?" he said quietly. There was a certain pride in his voice, like he was so proud of the fact that he'd brought this to my attention. "Yeah." He expanded the 3 images individually to each monitor, then he got up and left. It sounded like there was a skip in his step as he made his way down the hall and towards the kitchen. I stared hard at all 3 photos. My eyes could only stay on each one for so long. It was just so intimidating. Something about that man shaking the different murder victims' hands seemed so foreign, like he wasn't meant to actually be there. Then it struck me. There was something physically off about all 3 pictures. The man. He wasn't only dressed in the same clothes each time. The way his body leaned and oriented itself to the victim. It was the mirror image of the same person. Then I noticed the blurred lines, pixels around the edges. It was so subtle, so carefully done that I likely wouldn't have ever been able to notice until I'd been staring at all 3 pictures blown up on the monitors and laid out side by side. Those photos had been altered. That man felt off because he wasn't actually in any of those images. He'd been superimposed in there. What exactly had Seth done? Had he photoshopped the pictures himself and found a way to get them up on these dead people's Facebook pages? Had he tricked me somehow, and the truth was he had saved them on his computer all along? Was this some sick and twisted joke to freak me out? What else could his motivation possibly be? It was no longer a priority to get him out for a night of drinking with the boys. The only thing that mattered to me in that moment was getting out of that house and putting as much distance between me and him as possible. I stormed out of his room just as he returned with 2 glasses of water. I jogged over to the door and started putting my shoes on. "In a hurry?" he said. "I was hoping you would stick around and we could discuss. Maybe dive deeper into some theories about this man. Got to get back. Should I still come meet up with you guys at the Bull?" Sure. Actually, I don't know. I'll have to check if the guys are still thinking about going out." I slammed the door and ran all the way home. I don't care who saw me or how silly I looked. I needed to be away from Seth. I was ecstatic not to hear from Seth and safely assumed he'd chosen to bail on us in the end that night. I wound up drinking myself into oblivion at the bar. I needed the escape. I wouldn't have felt comfortable enough to take an Uber back out to the suburbs by myself and sleep comfortably in my own bed without it if I hadn't been so wasted. I think I could have slept into 4 or 5 in the afternoon the next day if I hadn't been woken up by my mother shaking me. She was on the verge of tears, saying something terrible had happened and that the police were at the door and needed to speak to me right away. They would question me briefly there and then, eventually bringing me down to the station to make sure they could get the most thorough and accurate series of events from the night before while it was still fresh in my mind. When I ran out of Seth's house the night before, it was apparently the last time anyone had seen him alive. He inexplicably decided that instead of coming out for a night of drinking, he would rather go for a midnight swim in the quarry on the other side of town. This was despite the fact he could hardly swim, and even decided not to mention anything to his parents or anyone else. They found his clothes resting on top of his shoes next to the water. His body was at the bottom, minor bruising all over his midsection. I told them everything exactly as it happened, even all the insanity he displayed, along with his extensive research and photoshopped pictures. Not that any of it would end up proving useful in the subsequent investigation. They held his funeral the next Saturday. It was a drizzly day. Patrons' suits and dresses were soaked through. They held it at the cemetery, built a little downriver from the Huntington Bridge. There was a photo display set up inside the main doors of the church. So many memories of the 2 of us and our group of friends were immortalized on that corkboard. I could have spent hours looking at it and reminiscing on the good times we had before his very sudden decline into self-exclusion a mysterious cause of death. My eyes trailed over all the photos until they stopped dead on the one on the bottom right corner. It wasn't pinned on like the others. This one had a couple staples running through it. My legs literally collapsed beneath me. My father had to rush over in a panic to pick me up. The photo was from inside his bedroom. The 3 monitors on his desk had familiar news articles on them. I lay flat on his bed with a mini football in my hands. The digital alarm clock read 7 p.m. Seth sat at the end of the bed, right next to my feet. He looked sad, staring into the camera, not like the old days when there was no murder obsession on his mind. On the right sat the same old man in the same old clothes and grinned at the camera too. He leaned and shook Seth's hand. I stared at it as intently as I could. That picture had not been photoshopped. Excuse me if I lack social grace. The past few years of my life have been spent in seclusion. My body repulses at the idea of telling this story, but I am afraid that after tonight, my mind may be too far gone to repeat it. I want to commit this story to paper so that people may know how I heard the music of Erich Zann. The first thing that greeted me at the hallway of the students' hall was a beheaded fish. It rested on a wooden cutting board with a butcher knife covered in a mess of guts next to it. I took a couple of steps into the hallway. I was greeted by the head of the fish. A shirtless ginger held it in his hands as a crowd of people gathered around him. They were all screaming, some of them trying to start chants, some of them simply shouting the word lad. As the crowd produced phones to etch this memory into eternity, the ginger lifted the fish head in the air, took a deep breath, and swallowed it. The drunken crowd went wild. Some clapped, some dry heaved, some simply screamed. These people would be my roommates for the next year. I had moved to Scotland for my studies. The universities back home were small, the job markets were limited, and I figured getting a start in an English-speaking country could open up more of the world to me. I thought that moving would be the first step towards adulthood. Instead, I got the student halls. The building I was moved into was a work in progress. The halls had 3 floors, but only the bottom floor was suited for student accommodation. The other 2 floors were strictly off limits to us. The closest people ever got to them was sneaking cigarettes in the emergency escape stairwell. Life was contained to the different dorm rooms and communal kitchen in the centre of the halls. I was assigned the room closest to the kitchen. The life in the halls was chaos. I tried fitting in. After the initial shock of my arrival, I stuck around for a couple of drinks. I tried some drugs, went out to the sweat-stench clubs where everyone would spend their evenings, yet the binges made me vomit. The pot put me in a self-aware panic, and the one time I pulled, it took me a dozen showers to wash off the shame of my one-night stand. During one outing, I even stole a traffic cone with some of the other freshmen. My trophy was proudly displayed in the kitchen, but after everyone had gone to sleep, I returned the cone back to where it belonged. It seemed cruel to let people stumble into the pothole in the street. The cone was there for a reason. Everyone around me was engaged in wanton self-destruction, but seemed to be doing just fine. They would snort horse tranquilizers in the evening, barely be able to talk during the night, but would be functional students come afternoon. Meanwhile, I would stay sober and struggle to get out of bed any hour of the day. The one habit I did pick up in the halls was smoking. Along with a handful of other smokers, I would sneak out to the fire escape stairwell for the occasional cigarette. The staircase had become the smoking room of the halls. Someone had draped a condom over the smoke detector and set up a small jar to serve as an ashtray. Within a week or two, the jar was overflowing with stubs. After a month, The jar disappeared completely. In its place was a mountain of cigarette butts that everyone just added to. A small gust of wind would feed a poorly put out cigarette and set the whole mound on fire. It was in the smoking room that I would manage to have actual conversations. One-on-one, people strayed away from the caricature of drunken freshers culture. They had options, they had stories. I even managed to find a handful of people who wanted to check out a jazz concert at the cafe across the street. Yet, as soon as we started to make plans, as soon as other people started getting invited, the group would morph into a crowd. A crowd had a mind of its own. The crowd wanted to go places where the walls were wet with perspiration. The crowd did not like jazz. I woke up late October to a knock on my door. It was around 3:30. It wasn't the first time I was woken up in the night. About 30 minutes earlier, the kitchen got loud. Two separate groups of clubgoers had collided while returning home. All the bars were closed, but they still wanted to drink. A meagre supply of booze was fetched from their rooms. The rest of the building was searched for alcohol. I was already halfway conscious when someone was screaming about not being able to find anything worth drinking on the forbidden floors. By the time the knock on my door came, I was fully awake. It was the ginger. He had a nasty-looking black eye, but seemed no less cheery for it. He wanted to know if I had any liquor. I didn't. He went on to the next door. The ginger made his rounds and managed to obtain some leftovers from some of the other people in the halls. The newly awakened joined in, gathering in the kitchen. The alcohol ran out again. The ginger made a scene of being irritated about the lack of booze. He ran through the halls screaming about how he just wanted one more drink. He finished off his rant by smashing his head through one of the flimsy dorm doors. The door he chose to break through was mine. His drunken face was embedded in the door. He looked at me in frozen terror, as if he was just planted into the situation out of nowhere, as if he had woken up with his head smashed into the strangest of places. Then he started to laugh. He kept on trying to put on his best Nicholas impression and say, "Here's Johnny." But his laughter kept on breaking his act. He was almost able to do the whole thing without gagging, but then he paused. He turned his attention inwards, took a deep breath and vomited on my floor. Then he left. I had a hole in my door and puke on my floor. A couple of people popped by my new window and mumbled half-hearted apologies. Then someone fished out a guitar and the whole crowd engaged in an intoxicated rendition of Wonderwall. I didn't know what to do. The thought of leaving the country and moving back home was nothing new. The first week in the hall set up a need to escape, and the rest of the stay just proved more justification. I could move back home, go to a local university, be back around my high school friends, perhaps reconnect with my high school sweetheart. I kept on trying to assess whether life in Scotland could be salvaged. I didn't want to leave. Withdrawing felt like failure, like I was tested by some foreign force and found wanting. The thought of retreat often kept me up at night as I balanced my options. On the night my door was smashed, however, there were no options. I just wanted out. I just wanted to sleep. I don't remember exactly what I said. The anger strung me along without my input. I yelled about the vomit, about the broken door, about how they were keeping everyone in the flat up. It was with the last point that I realized the extent of the gathering. Everyone in the halls was present. I was the odd one out. The crowd jeered at me. Everyone had something to say, but since everyone was talking at the same time, I couldn't make out a word. I listened to the undecipherable wave of hatred. I started to doubt myself. Maybe I was in the wrong here. Maybe I was being uptight. But wherever I stood, I just wanted out. I just wanted to sleep. Someone yelled something about the rooms upstairs being free. If I didn't want to be part of the crowd, I could be on my own. The rest of the freshers nodded on and cheered. Not wanting to listen to another barrage of insults, I grabbed my blanket and went upstairs. I took the stairwell to the forbidden floor. When it became apparent that I am indeed leaving, the crowd went wild. A rendition of Hey Hey Goodbye was drunkenly sung as I made my way up the stairwell. I could still hear them singing when I reached the second floor, but as soon as I left the stairwell and closed the door behind me, there was complete silence. The entire floor was perfectly still. The second floor was a perfect copy of the one below. The only visible difference was that it was much cleaner. The walls weren't smudged, and there were no vomit stains on the floor, no broken doors in sight. There also was a draft in the hallway, rather strange on a calm night, but I paid no mind to it. The still silence of the floor was the only important part. I sulked off to the room next to the kitchen out of habit. The door was unlocked. I rolled myself up in blankets and passed out. The next morning, I woke up on my own. For the first time since I entered the halls, I came out of my slumber without outside influence. There was no arguments in the hallway, no loud sex, no people smashing their heads through doors. I just woke up. I woke up in surprisingly good spirits. Nothing had really changed, but there was calmness in the air. The thoughts of dropping out started to seem rash. My mind raced with possibilities. I could join university societies to meet like-minded people. I could check in again with the smokers who liked jazz. That cafe across the street seemed ripe for a visit. Things looked hopeful. I spent a good hour in bed, thinking about how I could whip up my life into better shape, how I could go out there and experience the world and do the things I like to do back home. Maybe there was a second-hand instrument place where I could pick up a saxophone. It had been a while since I'd played, but the appetite to create music started to rise in me. I wanted to compose and read and talk and experience the world. The urge to go and do something got too strong for me to stay in bed. It was a beautiful day. I picked up a book from my old room and went to the cafe across the street. That day still sticks in my mind. I walked around with a pioneering optimism, rallying myself to face life. Every hurdle seemed passable. Memories of the past didn't sting. I started to realize that maybe the whole Scotland experiment wasn't a total failure. I had just had a troublesome arrival and was placed in a community that wasn't to my liking. I could meet new people. I could try new things. I could be happy. In the evening, I moved the rest of my things to my new room and settled down with a couple of shows. Then I went to sleep. As I drifted off, I recall being excited about the day to come, about setting up a life for myself in which I would be happy. That was the last time I felt sane. I woke up gasping for my breath. I managed to compose myself, my breathing mellowed, but I still felt a tightness in my chest. Whatever optimism I had during the day was now gone. It was replaced with a feeling of dread. My thoughts were so scattered I couldn't focus on any specific thing. All I knew was that everything was ruined and it was all my fault. That's when I noticed the music. The music was coming from the room above me. The sound was faint. Even in the silence, it was difficult to hold on to. Yet, as soon as I heard a small succession of the strained notes, the melody started to grow. My mind drifted with the music. As it caught onto a string of notes, quieter melodies emerged. I dug my nails into my palm. I squirmed. The music clawed at my soul. It was a sort of fugue with recurring melodies at its surface, but beneath it all, there was an inescapable dread. The notes whimpered as if they were pleading for their life, yet they were intercut with bursts of chaos, as if they knew their plea wouldn't be answered. The piece sounded like total anarchy, yet had a sort of order about it. Music indescribable with words. It was divorced of any genre, of any culture. It was divorced of anything human. Yet, as uncomfortable as it made me, it drew me in. As much as the music disturbed me, as much as it made my eyes bulge and muscles tense, There was something strangely alluring about it, something graspable, something forbidden. I laid in bed, trying to figure out what instrument could produce such harrowing tones. The more I focused, the louder the music got. I started to recognize a familiar sound in the chaos: an alto saxophone. Without thinking, I got up, put on my winter coat, and made my way towards the stairwell. Something deep within me was pulling me towards the unearthly melody. Something was demanding I get closer to the source. As I ascended the stairwell, the music grew louder. The louder it got, the more layers started to emerge. The melody transcended the instrument it was played on. It chipped away at something darker, a sort of cosmic truth. Whoever created this music was supremely talented. I needed to see them play. At the top of the stairwell, I encountered an orange traffic cone. Someone must have stashed it up there, fearing a building inspection of the dorms. I pushed it aside and entered the 3rd floor. The 3rd floor was barren. There was no carpeting, there was no kitchen, just a long row of doors. A small bit of light emanated from one of them. It was the room from which the music came from. I made my way towards that door. The creaky floor sounded off beneath my feet as I made my way across the hall. The groans of the wood accompanied the music, as if all in existence was part of the maddening tune. I stopped at the door and took a deep breath. I was standing in front of a stranger's door, wearing nothing but my underwear and a winter coat. I wanted to think of what I was going to say to this stranger, but before I knew it, my hand had knocked on the door. The music stopped. For a moment, everything was still, as if the person on the other side of the door was pretending they weren't home. Then, the floorboards started to creak. The blinders of an unseen window were pulled shut, and then the room went silent again. My common sense was telling me I should leave. The music was gone, and my head started to clear. I wanted to be back in bed. Yet, my hand knocked for the 2nd time. A flurry of activity arose from the other side of the door. The wooden floor creaked as if someone ran around the room. Furniture was rattled, things were pushed around. I could hear him talking in deep breaths. Then, he opened the door. His eyes were manic. They leapt all across my body as if he was recognizing a human for the first time in his life. His face modulated between fear and joy, as if he didn't know which to choose. Before me stood a clearly unstable old man. I introduced myself to him and told him I had heard him play. He opened his mouth to respond, but froze. A strange squeak escaped from his toothless gums. He grabbed me by the hand and led me to the room. I followed. He immediately made his way towards a small desk and started writing something out on a piece of paper. His room was barren, missing many of the usual pieces of furniture a student room would have. There was no wardrobe, bookshelf, or even a bed frame. The old man presumably slept on the old mattress on the floor. The mattress possessed a strange bump, as if something was hiding beneath it. The only furniture in the room was a rickety-looking desk and chair. The old man finished writing. He picked up the paper with his bony fingers, but as he moved towards me, he took pause. He studied me. A glint of pity showed in his eyes, as if whatever was written on that note would bring me great harm. The blinders on the window quivered from an unfelt gust of wind. He handed me the paper. "Excuse me if I lack social grace. It has been many years since I have had a visitor. My name is Erich Zann. My voice is mute, but I can play an instrument. Would you like to hear a song?" I nodded. That is why I came there, to hear him play. Zann excitedly reached beneath his mattress and produced his instrument. As I had guessed, it was an alto saxophone. The alto was in a horrible shape, however, covered in dents and scratches. There was no way it could produce any sort of clear sound. The insanity of the situation started to dawn on me. I wanted to get up and leave, but the old man seemed so excited. His eyes now sparked with pure joy. Any hint of anxiety had been stifled. He looked at me for reassurance. I nodded. He picked up his saxophone, started tapping his foot, and mouthed a countdown. 3, 2, 1. The old man launched into his song. There was a joyous rage in it, nothing like the music I had heard moments earlier, but fascinating nevertheless. Zann played with the mark of a prodigy. His ability on the saxophone was breathtaking. As fascinating as the music was, however, his movements took away from the show. He had transformed from a feeble old man to a wild youth dancing across the room. His frail body bounced around off the walls as the piece got more energetic. He came alive through the music. His energy built until he reached the crescendo. Then he fell into his chair. I applauded. That was, hands down, the best performance I had ever witnessed. The old man was joyous. His toothless smile beamed. I complimented him once more, but told him that it was not this song I was after. His face froze. I once again thanked him for his performance, but asked him whether he could play the song he had played earlier. He propped himself up from the chair, took a few laboured breaths, and then started to tap his feet. 3, 2, 1. The man launched into the same song he had just finished playing. The music was still enthralling, but he was exhausted from his previous performance. His fingers started to slip. He was fumbling notes. The previous running around the room was now replaced with a slow shuffle. Seeing the man clearly struggle, I interrupted him. I explained once again that I was very thankful for his initial performance, but that I wanted to hear the song that he had previously played. He avoided looking in my eyes. His gaze kept on shifting over to the window. I repeated both my appreciation and request. He nodded his head. 3, 2, 1. It was the same damn song. I grabbed him. I explained myself once again. I wanted to hear the song that he played before. The man seemed terrified, but I had come far enough to hear what I came to hear. I figured I would jog his memory with the tune itself. I attempted to whistle out a couple of the tones. His eyes bulged at the sound of them. The blinders on the window shuddered. He slapped me. We both jumped back from the shock. He held his hand as if it was some foreign appendage. He looked up at me in horror and pressed the finger to his mouth. Shh. He kept on making the sound as he ushered me out of the room. Shh. He slammed the door. I heard him sit down on his mattress. As I stood in the hall, I could hear him shushing something in his room. It was as if my whistling of the notes had been such a brazen insult that he had to calm the cosmos itself. Shh. The slap didn't hurt. Zann was far too frail to cause any pain, but it knocked some sense into me. I was standing in the middle of a locked-off area in my underwear and winter coat. I just received a concert from a strange old man who hides at the top floor of my student halls. None of this was normal. It was time to sleep. I woke up to an unpleasant surprise. A stern-looking university employee was lecturing me on how breaking house rules could jeopardize the future of my education. I was forced back down to the chaos of my old room. A building inspection had arrived earlier in the morning. They were greeted with stained carpets, broken glass, and smashed-up doors. The first student they had met had a face covered in Sharpie dicks. We did not pass inspection. The halls were, once again, reminded of the rules about student housing. Quiet time after 10 p.m, no drinking in the halls, and an absolute avoidance of the other floors. We were put on a probationary period. There would be a housing inspection coming to our halls every week. Everyone was livid. Somehow, it had become an accepted truth that I was responsible for the building inspection. The fact that there was a reminder email sent out the previous week about university employees coming to the halls was completely irrelevant. This was all somehow my revenge for the door that the ginger slipped into. Within half an hour of the building inspection, people started, accidentally, dropping cans and other garbage through the hole in my door. Apparently, it looked just like a trash disposal. I wouldn't be getting a new door for at least a week. I spent the whole day in bed. The room reeked of freshly cleaned vomit. People kept on shouting in the halls. Trash kept on getting thrown into my room. Yet none of it mattered. The only thing that I could think about was the horrid melody I'd heard the night before. I was paralyzed in my bed. My mind was filled with horrible realizations. As the music played in my head, I was consumed with images of home. If I returned, my parents would be disappointed. My friends would have moved on. I would be alone. In my heart of hearts, I knew that the person who I'd cared so much about during my high school years was now with someone else. A stranger that they had met in a bar. A stranger that they had grown to love. A stranger that was better than me. Erich Zann's demented melody accompanied all of those thoughts. A soundtrack of the world moving on and leaving me in a shallow grave. In the evening, most of the halls went out to drink. The room was still not quiet. Knowing that the halls were almost empty, the people who were left behind visited each other's rooms and engaged in roaring acts of passion. The grunts and moans echoed through the halls, yet the music of Erich Zann persisted in my memory. The sounds of ecstasy became a backing chorus to the otherworldly melody stuck in my head. What once sounded like cries of pleasure now sounded like wails of hopelessness. The tune bent the world. It forced the universe to justify its existence to the beat. Around midnight, the moans had died down. Snoring could be heard from one of the other rooms. I had spent the whole day trying to conserve enough willpower to move. My reserves had finally gathered enough energy for me to go have a cigarette. I put my coat on and headed towards the stairwell. The stairwell was untouched. It seemed like the building inspection had somehow missed all of the fire code violations. The mountain of cigarette butts still lay where it was the night before. The condom still covered the smoke detector. I lit up and looked outside of the window at the cafe across the street. I desperately tried to latch on to the memories of the day I had spent in that cafe. I searched my soul for some sort of trace of contentment, a sign that the state of things could be redeemed. Beneath my current state, there was something else. There was a reality that I lived when the world was fine. I almost tasted that sweet elixir of the past. But then, I heard the music. The memory of Zann's melody paled in comparison to its harrowing performance. His song reverberated through the stairwell. As soon as one of those notes sent a chill down my spine, I knew I had no choice. I threw my half-smoked cigarette on the pile and ran upstairs. My movements were not my own. I was present, but it felt as if I had passed on the controls of my body to some other force. I sprinted up the stairs with no attention for my safety. Even though my body shuddered with dread the closer I got to the source of the music, I craved to near it. I needed to hear more. When I reached the third floor, the safety cone was back where it was the night before. I threw it aside, not paying any mind to how it had travelled back to the door. I moved swiftly, but as soon as I reached the wooden floors, my movement slowed. I found myself crouched, each step calculated by a force outside of me as to not produce any creaks. I snuck my way towards Zann's door as the music grew. The music had always sounded bizarre, but the closer I got, the more convinced I was that it was outside of the human realm. Zann played alone. His alto was the most prominent within the composition, but there were other instruments hidden within. Strings, percussion, even the hint of a moaning voice could be heard, but only if one focused. When other thoughts entered my mind, such as the insanity of the entire event, the other instruments died down. Yet, my focus would always be restored. Zann's demented melody would not allow for other thoughts to coexist. I wanted to press my ear against the door. I wanted to be fully consumed by the dark song that he played. But instead, the door opened. A gentle gust of wind had slowly unlocked the door and spread it open without alerting Zann. I could finally see the master at play. The man was clearly in pain. All of the gusto and energy of the previous performance were gone. Instead of jumping around the room, Zann was curled up with his saxophone on the floor. It was as if he was lost at sea, and his instrument was the only thing keeping him afloat, as if his music was a cry to be rescued from certain death. He faced the window, as if he was playing to it. The blinders had been lifted, and one could see outside. Except, what was outside of Zann's window wasn't the quiet skyline of the city. It was pitch darkness. Beyond the glass lay the abyss, and within that abyss, something called to me. I took another step forward. The floor creaked. Zann didn't even turn around to see where the noise had come from. As soon as the creak sounded off, he launched at the blinders and pulled them down. Keeping whatever was beyond those blinders secret was more important than his self-preservation. He held them still as they quivered, and only once he was sure that whatever was beyond the window was safely concealed, he turned around. His eyes searched me once again. His face went through a flurry of different emotions until it finally settled. He smiled his toothless smile. A sort of relief seemed to have passed through his body, as if being in company had made whatever terror he was facing subside. He grabbed me by the hand and led me into the room. As soon as I was inside, he wrote a quick note on his desk. As he handed me the paper, he let out something akin to a laugh. His eyes were wet. He was on the verge of tears. Excuse me if I lack social grace. My better years are past me, and I'm not used to others. You have come here for an explanation of the music, and I apologize for withholding that previously. Please, give me some time to explain. I nodded. Zann sat down at his desk and started to diligently write out his story. As he wrote, he would occasionally stop and stare at the page, as if he himself could not believe what he had written. After a moment of shock, he would start to laugh. It was not a laughter of humor, rather an imitation of laughter, something forced, something to coat what was on the paper with a hue of absurdity which he did not see. During these painful bursts of faux amusement, Zann would look over to me for reassurance, as if he wanted me to laugh with him. I would give him a polite chuckle, and he would continue writing. He had about 5 pages of his story written when he paused again. This time, however, he did not look at the page. He stared at the window. It was imperceptible at first, but as soon as he drew my attention, I could hear it too. A low tone came from the outside. The blinders started to vibrate. Zann quickly went back to writing. Now his careful lettering was gone. The man started to furiously scribble, trying to get out as many words as possible. His breath quickened. He started to whimper. The tone from the window grew. It strengthened in volume and grew in pitch. With every second that the tone advanced, Zann started to write more and more erratically. The tone had reached an unbearable tenacity. What was once a whisper in the silence was now an unearthly roar. The blinders bounced up and down the window, trying to contain whatever force hid behind it. Zann wrote his last words and leapt to his feet. He pressed the stack of papers into my hand and started to usher me out of the room. He wanted me out. Whatever mad writings I had in my hands were to get as far away as possible. That is when the window burst. It all happened quickly. The tone had reached an unbearable frequency. The glass of the window cracked and exploded beneath its pressure. Suddenly, a blast of wind rose from the window and circled around the room. It started to pull towards the outside. The blinders were ripped away to the darkness beyond. The whole room bent towards the window. I tried holding onto the papers, but before I knew it, they were out of my hands. They flew out of the window and immediately disappeared into the darkness. Whatever was beyond the window was angry. The tone had grown from a high-pitched squeal to a low growl. I wanted to run, but instead, my body pulled me closer to the window. The abyss beyond beckoned. Zann tried to hold me back, but my arm knocked the frail man down. I could hear his whimpers for a few moments, but the growl from the abyss soon overpowered any notion of sound. I tried grabbing onto the table so that I could stop, so that I could turn around and go back to the safety of my room, but my body refused to cooperate. I reached the window and wrapped my hands around the outside. I was pulled out into the nothingness. The growl suddenly disappeared. As I leaned outside of the window, a still silence took hold. The abyss motioned towards me. My fingers squirmed on the windowsill. I tried to look away, but there was something there that demanded my attention. I was being invited in. I was being ordered in. I jumped. When my consciousness returned my body, I was immediately seized with a flurry of pain. I had landed in a bush, breaking most of my fall. My jacket had shielded me from most of the harm, but it was destroyed in the process. I tangled myself out of it, escaping with a couple of scrapes. I watched the fire. By all accounts, it had started in the emergency stairwell. The smoke detector had somehow malfunctioned, and by the time the fire was noticed, it was far too late to save anything of the building. By surprise, the halls were gone. None of the students were injured, but all of our possessions had turned to ash. The idea of asking about Zann seemed insane. I vowed to keep the events of that night to myself. Until tonight, I have. I left Scotland shortly after the fire. The university provided us with new halls, and the building I got assigned to was significantly calmer, but I wanted to get as far away from the source of the music as I could. I moved back home and tried to carry on with my life. On the surface, things have been normal since then. I stumbled through my 20s in an unremarkable fashion. I would go to work, I would get paid, I would come back home. I've had friends, even the odd relationship, but they never would stay for long. People would filter in and out of my life, but the memory of Zann's music stayed constant. When I first arrived back home, I felt aimless. I would spend days lying in bed, wondering what I was meant to do with my life. In about a mania, I fished out my old saxophone and played it. I figured that perhaps playing some music could make me feel better. When I played, my mood had not improved. But whatever took control of me that dreadful night had returned. As soon as I got out a couple of notes, Zann's melody returned to me. That horrible tune started to burrow its way into my head once more. I've been practicing. For years, I practiced every waking moment that I could afford. I have lived frugally and settled into the life of a hermit. It has taken me years, but bit by bit, I was able to rediscover fragments of Zann's music. Whenever I would play a series of those demented notes, the room would grow cold. The blinds of my windows would quiver. I've never been able to play the whole song. Sections would emerge in my mind, but I lacked the practice to perform the full piece. I have never been able to play the full song until tonight. I do not know whether I'll come from this performance with my mind intact. Every fibre of my being is telling me to let this Zann business go, and there is nothing more that I would like to do than wake up and be freed of the music's grasp. But I have no choice. The melody demands to be heard. What I do now, I do not of my own free will. May this document serve as evidence of that. I bid you good night. May you turn away when you are faced with temptation. 3, 2, 1. 7 years ago, I met the girl who could find the seams. You've got to see what Danny can do. I let myself be dragged across the park, past the swings and to the big oak tree, where a girl with long black hair sat with a pile of books beside her. She looked up at the small crowd of fellow children surrounding her, sighed, and set her book down. Can I help you? My best friend at the time, Jacob, beamed and plopped a stuffed bear on her lap. Do the thing! Luca hasn't seen you do it yet, he said. Danny looked at me, and my gaze immediately went to my shoes. You don't have to if you don't want to, I murmured, feeling embarrassed about all the fuss my friend was causing. Jacob scoffed and crossed his arms. You don't even know what she does yet. Come on, Danny, show him. I don't mind showing you, she said, before picking up the bear. She brushed her fingers against its face, and she smiled, before she took a middle finger and ran it from the top of its head to its tummy. Like she'd taken a sharp knife to it, the bear split open, revealing white stuffing and the red heart that had been placed in there when Jacob got it. She lifted it up to show it to us all, before plopping it back on her lap and running a finger along the tear. When she pulled her hand away, the bear was whole again, like she'd never ripped it open. Jacob scooped the bear back up and turned to me. Cool, right? He said. I shrugged. I don't know, I guess, I said, knowing I probably looked less than convinced. Danny smiled and then got to her feet. Okay, what do you want to see the inside of? She asked. I glanced around the playground before pointing to the swing set. That. Can you cut that with your finger? I asked. I might have only been a kid, but I was definitely not convinced by just cloth. Danny nodded and walked over, the crowd of kids following her in awe. She patted the chain of the pink swing before her finger sliced right through one of the links. The chain came free, and she proceeded to slice open the plastic of the seat. She picked up the mangled swing, spinning around to show how it really wasn't attached at all, before she reattached it, with all the touch of a finger. Now that convinced me. I probably looked like an idiot, just standing there with my jaw dropped while everyone else just clapped. How do you do that? I asked in wonder. Danny shoveled her feet, a small smile on her lips. Everything has a seam I can pop open. I can do it to anything, she admitted. I dug through my pockets and managed to pull out my 3DS. Can you open this up? I asked. For the rest of the afternoon, Danny demonstrated her unique and bizarre powers to us. She did open up my 3DS, showing off all the electronics inside, and once she fixed it back up, it booted up just like nothing had happened. She opened up a Rubik's Cube, part of a branch, the monkey bars. Whatever we asked, she would demonstrate. Only if no adults were close though. One of the other kids suggested she open up one of the cars in the parking lot, and she refused. One by one, we all went home for dinner, until it was just me and Danny. I was pretty awkward at that age, so we just stood in silence for an uncomfortably long time before I finally piped up with a question on my mind. What do you want to open up? She stared at me in surprise for a bit, before she shrugged. I don't know. I don't really do it for myself anymore. I just do it so everyone else likes me, she said. I plopped down on the ground and pulled out my 3DS. I don't have to be home for a while longer. My parents are working late. Want to play some games with me? I asked. I don't think anyone really asked Danny to do something with them before that didn't involve her cutting some random object open. But she slowly nodded and sat beside me. And until it got dark, we played games. I probably would have stayed out longer if the red light signifying low battery didn't start glaring at us. I'll come back and play with you tomorrow, okay? I said, sticking it in my pocket. Danny was grinning from ear to ear, her smile filled with joy. I really like that, Luca," she said. That summer, I spent a lot of time in the park. Of course, it was fun watching Danny cut open whatever object we brought her, but it was more fun just talking with her. She was a really nice girl, after all, just quiet. There were several times I'd be playing my 3DS while she'd watch, and she'd end up falling asleep on my shoulder. She told me most nights she spent wandering around her home rather than sleeping. She never slept well. Then one day I came to the park while it was raining. I had the stomachache of a lifetime, but I wanted to see Danny, and she was there, as always. The rain was more of a mist in the air rather than a downpour, but I was more than glad to take a seat under the tree. Danny, of course, immediately picked up that things were off. "What's wrong? You don't look so good," she asked, pulling her knees up to her chest. "Stomachache. Mom said there's a flu going around, so don't get too close," I said. "What, are your barf all over me?" Danny giggled, before something clicked in that head of hers. "Luca, you know when you asked me earlier this summer what I'd really want to open the seam of?" I nodded. "I lied. I kinda want..." She blushed a little and murmured the next sentence so quietly I could barely make it out. "I kinda want to see if a person has a seam." I responded by wiggling out of my t-shirt. "Sure, maybe you can see what's wrong with my stomach," I said. I know, what kind of dumbass move is that? But I was a kid, and what kid isn't a little curious about what goes on inside them? Danny clearly didn't expect my enthusiastic consent, but she did a little dance in place before glancing around. "No one else is out here, but let's go behind the bushes just in case," she said. Excitement brimming up between the two of us, we hid behind the bushes as I laid down on the ground, staring up at the grey sky. It was peaceful back there. "Okay, just start checking," I said. Danny knelt above me, and her cold fingers ran over my chest. I tried not to squirm since I was so ticklish. For several quiet seconds, I just laid there, wondering when she'd start. "You can start whenever," I said, thinking she was losing courage. "I've already started." I glanced down, and sure enough, she had. I hadn't felt a thing, but my skin over my torso had been opened right up, cut down from the top of my sternum down to my belly button. Skin, muscle and ribs were just pulled open into the sides, so Danny could dig around in my guts. She slit open my stomach and saw remnants of digested food, the pancakes I'd had for breakfast. She sealed that back up quickly so nothing was disturbed as she proceeded to run her fingers through my intestines. "That's so cool," I whispered, afraid if someone caught us now, the little spell she had over me would be broken. "I'm not even bleeding." It was true. There was not a single drop of blood lost. Nothing seemed desperate to pop out of me either. It was just there. I could see my heart beating, my lungs inflating and deflating with each level breath. I should have been afraid, but I wasn't. I was just fascinated to see what was going on inside of my body. "There's something wrong." Danny scowled as she continued to prod, and then I felt a bit of hot pain. "Careful," I hissed. "Sorry, I don't really know how, but I think there's something really wrong in here. Hold still, I'm going to put you back together." I stayed still as she finished zipping up my chest. I sat up and poked at my chest as if I expected my seam to burst open and everything to come spilling out all at once. "What do you mean something's wrong?" Danny shrugged. "I don't know. I really don't. I just looked around in there and something doesn't feel right to me. Go talk to your mom. I think she needs to take you to the doctor. Did you really not feel anything when I cut your seam?" I shook my head and got to my feet, grimacing as that pain from my gut flared up. "Not a thing. You're awesome, Danny. I'm going to go home now, though," I said. "Please hurry." I went home and somehow managed to nag my mom long enough into taking me to the doctor's office about my stomachache. Of course, I'm sure you guessed by now, it wasn't just a stomachache. Appendicitis. Luckily, it was all taken out before anything bad happened, but I was bedridden for 2 weeks. When I was finally well enough to play, I couldn't find Danny at the park. Asking around revealed she hadn't been back since that rainy day. She was gone, and she didn't come back into my life until the beginning of this school year. I barely recognized her at first. I'm not really a tall guy, but even compared to your average guy, Danny was practically a tree. She cut her hair short and she'd grown up, but I saw her face and I knew. "Danny!" I ran up to her and nearly plowed her over in my eagerness to get to her. Danny nearly jumped out of her skin as she looked down at me, and she realized who I was. "Luca, is that you?" she asked. I nodded eagerly, probably looking like an idiot. "Yes, oh my god, Danny, you're so tall," I said. When she smiled, I felt like I was a kid in the park all over again. "And you're still Luca. I'm so glad to see you," she said before giving me a quick hug. "Do you have lunch next period? We can talk then, catch up." I barely touched my food because I was just too excited to talk to Danny. She was on the girls' basketball team, was already saving up money for college in a few years. She wanted to be a vet. Meanwhile, all I did was join the school's anime club and still have no idea what I want to do for a living. But she still listened. We didn't talk about seams. It was a silent agreement between us not to. I knew it happened. It wasn't something I made up. But the seams were something from childhood. We didn't need to open them up again. Well, we didn't. Until Danny was hit by a car and left to die by the side of the road. I only heard about it the following morning. One of her team members actually tracked me down to tell me. Apparently, I was the only person outside of the team that was really friends with her. Danny always worked late, and while she was walking home, some drunk joyriders plowed over her. She was found hours later, somehow still alive, and taken to the hospital. Several bones, including both legs and one arm, were broken. Ribs cracked. She was concussed and she lost a lot of blood. She'd be okay in the end, but there was a lot of recovery ahead of her. I nearly cried the first time I visited the hospital. Gratefully, she was sleeping at the time, so she didn't hear me sniffling, but I left her a card. It was sitting in her lap when I visited her the next day, and she was awake. But along with her body, her heart had been broken too. "I'm never going to play basketball again." "Don't say that," I tried to soothe her. Danny snorted. "Even if I can walk again, I'll never walk without a limp, and running will be flat out. It's not a big deal." The way she shuddered when she said, "not a big deal," gave away quickly that it was, in fact, a big deal. I held her hand, and she squeezed her eyes tight as she struggled not to cry. "I don't know what to do. They have no idea who hit me. I just know it was a black truck, that's all. They ruined my life, and they're not even going to pay for it," she said. "Danny, do you remember the seams?" Danny jolted like I'd hit her with a bolt of electricity. "What about the seams?" she asked cautiously. I pulled up my shirt to show off my appendectomy scar. "You were right that day about what was wrong. I might be dead now if you didn't find my seam and look inside. I remember them, but do you?" "I've never forgotten." Her hand stroked mine, and I watched as the skin split over the back of my hand. Another touch, and it sealed right back up, good as new. It's why I want to be a vet. You know how many animals I could save with my gift?" "That's amazing," I said, flexing my hand. "That day at the park, you didn't come back after that." Danny nodded. I scared myself a bit after I cut you open. And then, when you didn't come back the next day, I started having nightmares that your chest exploded and all your organs slid out of you. I didn't want to go to the park if you weren't there anyway." Her brow furrowed. "Why are you bringing this up now? I can't heal myself. I can only close a seam I opened." I swallowed before leaning in close and lowering my voice. "Does opening a seam have to be painless?" I asked. It took a second for Danny to get it, but she shook her head. "It can hurt as much as I want it to," she said, her gaze turning cold. "Then leave the rest to me. You work on getting better, and I promise I'm going to find out who did this to you." It did take months to track them down, but I got help. The girls' basketball team. They want to help Danny, and all I said was I was going to get her justice. They put out feelers, and we got something. Corey. I never really knew Corey. He ran in a different crowd, but he had a black truck, drunk like a fiend, and rumour had it he bragged to a few close friends that he ran over that goth girl, aka my friend Danny. My first initial instinct was to just go up and punch him in the face, but I knew that wouldn't work. I'd just get expelled. So I did the next best thing. I knew Corey was a terrible student, and we take the same bus to school. I waited until I heard him moaning about struggling with last night's math homework, and then I turned around. "Hey man, if you need a bit of help, I can double check your work. Fill in all the right answers if you missed any." He looked baffled, but handed me the paper. I did my best not to cringe at how god-awful his handwriting was, but I corrected his work and handed it back just as we got to school. The next day, Corey slung his arm around my shoulders and said, "Pal, buddy, I got 100% on that last assignment. I think this is the start of something beautiful." I smiled back at him. "I think it is," I replied. So yes, for the last month, I became Corey's personal slave. I finished his homework, and in return, he was somewhat nice to me. He also blabbed a lot, and it got so hard not to just wreck his face when he told me about the night he ran over the goth. But I just thought of Danny in physical therapy, doing her damn best to walk again, and I just smiled and laughed. I got the names of the other two guys in his car, his closest friends, Jay and Thomas. I waited. The waiting was the hardest part, and I'm pretty sure my own grades slid a bit while I was doing both Corey's homework and my own. But it was all worth it for tonight. Because tonight, Corey and his friends were at a party, and I swung by at around midnight to see them stumbling out of the house, laughing their drunk asses off. I rolled down my window and called out their names, offering them a ride. They'd no doubt get pulled over in their condition, and hey, I had some more booze in my car. They could keep the party going in the back seat. Me, I was just the ass-kissing nerd that had been doing Corey's homework for the past month. They never even considered that I drugged the beers I so happily handed them in the back seat. One by one, they passed out, and I went on to phase 3 of my plan. I'd planned ahead. I'd let 3 members of the basketball team know that the kind of justice I was looking for wasn't by getting them arrested and have them serve a nothing sentence while Danny was going to struggle for so much longer with the injuries they gave her. I knew these 3 would go with it. They'd set up the perfect place. A basement in an abandoned building. I was impressed by how much effort they put into it. Plastic was rolled over the floor and parts of the walls. There was a pile of zip ties and 3 chairs set up in the center of the room. The hard part was dragging their unconscious asses down there. By the time I got the last one down there, I was sweating like a pig. But oh, it was all worth it when I brought Danny there, and she saw all three of them tied up and just starting to stir. She softly gasped as she looked between them. "And you're sure these are the guys?" she asked quietly. I nodded and gestured to them. "Do whatever you want," I said. Danny grinned ear to ear before she walked up to them. Corey was the first to really come to, his eyes fluttering, and he groaned before saying, "How much did I drink last night?" "Too much," Danny chirped, pacing back and forth in front of her prey. That woke him right up. Corey's head shot up and all the blood rushed out of his face as he recognized the girl in front of him, still walking with a crutch to support herself. He, of course, immediately tried to play dumb. "Do I know you? Because I've dated a lot of girls, so I can't really keep track of them." Danny slugged him across the face. "I'm the girl you ran over with your truck," she said, still smiling. Jay and Thomas had woken up from their beauty sleep by this time. Corey spat out a mouthful of blood before looking up and smirking at Danny. "Sorry, don't remember you," he said, smugness oozing out of the creep. Danny circled around the trio of hungover morons, watching how Jay flinched every time he heard the sound of her crutch hitting the ground. "I think he remembers," she hummed before she paused in front of Jay. Jay swallowed before glancing over at the others. "No, I don't," he mumbled. Danny cocked her head to the side before she lifted up her hand. She waggled her fingers and then caressed the middle one right up his jawline and over his cheekbone. Jay barely recognized that his cheek was hanging off from a last inch of connecting flesh before Danny just grabbed it and ripped it right off. Jay screamed at the top of his lungs, blood pouring down his mangled face and down his neck. I could see his teeth and gums. The others looked on in horrified silence as Danny dropped the piece of flesh onto the plastic. "Let's try this again. Do you remember now?" "Yes," Jay wailed, tears sprouting at the corner of his eyes. "Damn, it wasn't me driving. It was Corey. I thought we just hit a deer or something, but in the morning we heard about you. I wanted to tell someone, I swear, but they wouldn't let me. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Danny hummed and nodded as Jay continued to babble his desperate apologies. "I believe you, so you won't suffer any longer," she said, right before she drew a finger right across Jay's neck. So much blood poured down the front of his shirt, a waterfall of blood splattering against the plastic as Jay's head lolled down. He certainly didn't suffer. He was dead in minutes. And all during those minutes, Corey and Tom were screaming in terror. Any of Corey's smugness had vanished when Danny ripped open his friend's face and then cut his throat. Danny turned a murderous stare onto the other two, still smiling from ear to ear. Thomas glanced down at her hand and realized it first. Where's your knife?" he stammered. All she did was raise her hand into the air and waggle her fingers. "These are my knives. I've always been a bit special." She carefully avoided the blood puddle as she limped over to Thomas. "And even though I'll probably never play basketball or have full mobility again, you can't take away my gift to find the seam in everything." With just a brush of her fingers, she sliced through Thomas's jersey, and although he begged for his life, she just slowly dragged a hand from his stomach up to his collarbone while he howled in agony. Watching his skin just split by a touch was mesmerizing. The cut so precise, it was like a surgeon's scalpel. Another slice over the gut, and everything just spilled out. This was nothing like letting her find my seam in childhood, where everything just stayed perfectly still. I never knew how really long the intestines were until I watched them plop onto the floor, still twitching and alive. Thomas stared in horror at his disemboweled guts until Danny dove her hand into his chest and I heard the loudest squish. Thomas's eyes rolled back and he almost immediately expired. Danny pulled out the remnants of his heart before throwing it on the ground. Corey was crying now, snot dribbling down his lips as he pulled frantically at his zip ties. "Please, it was just an accident. It was just an accident, you crazy girl," he yelped as she trotted in front of him. Danny had been smiling until Corey called her a crazy girl. The smile dropped and she sighed, crossing her reddened arms across her chest. "It was an accident that you drove drunk? Was it an accident that you just drove away? You didn't even attempt to call 911? Was it an accident you spent all your time until now laughing about running me over? Maybe I am crazy. Maybe I am. But if I'm crazy, then you're a downright sociopath, and the odds are you'll kill someone else the next time an accident happens." She knelt down to his level and flicked his nose, watching the tip go flying off and sticking to the wall. Corey crossed his eyes to see the damage and promptly peed himself. I could see the stain in his jeans. "Hey, Corey," Danny giggled, her smile returning and bordering on maniacal. "You ever heard of a torture called death by 1,000 cuts?" "I'm just taking a break. Corey and Danny are still in the basement. Last I saw him though, he barely even looked like a person anymore. She'd removed his nose, lips, ears and eyelids. He's bald, cuts covering his entire scalp. Dozens of surgical cuts are decorating his arms, legs, torso. And he's still alive, staring unblinkingly, someplace past begging and tears. But she's not going to let him die just yet. After all, she's been suffering for months because of that accident. He can take a few days before she finally lets him go.